Hey guys, tonight we begin with the life of a medieval peasant during the Hundred Years' War. A daily grind shaped by failing crops, wandering mercenaries, plague-ridden winters, and tax collectors who somehow always showed up on time. It was less a peaceful village life and more a slow, smoky crawl through hunger, fear, and whatever crumbs the war left behind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up in a straw-stuffed mattress loft above a stable, the air thick with the scent of animals and wood smoke. Beneath you, the cows shift and groan in their sleep. Outside, the morning fog hangs low over the fields, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls. Not a church bell. Those were melted down years ago to pay for a local lord's campaign. Just a hand-forged iron clapper swinging from a pole, reminding everyone that it is time to gather again and hear the latest news about new taxes or passing danger. Being a peasant during the 100 Years' War was not just difficult. It was constant and exhausting. Your day began before dawn, when the roosters crowed and the first pale light crept through the gaps in your shutters. The wooden floors creaked under your feet as you descended the ladder from your sleeping loft, careful not to wake the children who slept curled together like puppies for warmth. The fire in the hearth had died to embers during the night, and you knelt to coax it back to life with dried twigs and a bellows made from goatskin. The smoke stung your eyes and caught in your throat, but you were grateful for the warmth it provided against the morning chill. Water had to be fetched from the well at the village center, carried in wooden buckets that grew heavier with each step back to your dwelling. The well was often the first place you heard the news of the day. Who had been taken by fever in the night? Which fields had been trampled by passing soldiers? Whether the miller's son had returned from his lord's latest campaign, or if his bones now lay somewhere in a foreign field. The animals required constant attention. Your few chickens scratched in the dirt behind your house, producing eggs that were more precious than silver. A single hen could mean the difference between a meal and an empty belly. The family cow, if you were fortunate enough to own one, needed milking twice daily. Her milk provided not only nourishment, but also the cream that could be churned into butter, a luxury that might be traded for salt or iron tools. Life always hovered near the edge, even before the fighting began. A good year meant just enough grain to make it through winter. A bad year meant searching the woods for bitter acorns and hoping they could be softened into something edible. During wartime, bad years became expected. Armies trampled fields. Mills were burned. Food meant for your children was taken by soldiers who neither spoke your language nor cared to. It did not matter whether they served the English king or the French one. They all needed grain, and they all took it. The soil itself told the story of this endless struggle. In peaceful times, the earth responded to careful tending. You knew every furrow of your family's strips in the common field could read the land like scripture. Here, the ground held water after rain. There, it dried quickly and needed extra care. You saved seeds from the best plants, traded with neighbors for different varieties, and followed the ancient rhythms of planting and harvest that had sustained your people for generations. But war changed everything. Armies moved like locusts across the landscape, consuming everything in their path. A company of soldiers could destroy a year's work in a single afternoon. They drove their horses through standing wheat, used fence posts for firewood, and slaughtered livestock for fresh meat. What they could not eat immediately, they often destroyed to deny it to their enemies. The earth itself became a casualty, trampled and scarred by the passage of armed men. The seasons, once reliable markers of hope and renewal, became sources of dread during wartime. Spring brought not just the promise of new crops, but also the fear of new campaigns. Summer meant not just growth and abundance, but also the dry roads that made travel easier for armies. Autumn brought not just harvest, but also the knowledge that hungry soldiers would soon be looking for winter quarters. Winter offered not just rest, but also the terrible uncertainty of whether your stores would last until spring. Weather took on new meaning when survival hung in the balance. A late frost could kill seedlings and doom a village to starvation. Too much rain could rot the grain in the fields, or make it impossible to bring in the harvest. Drought could parch the earth and leave the wells dry. But even perfect weather was no guarantee of safety, because perfect weather was also perfect for waging war. The tools of your trade were simple but precious. A wooden plow pulled by an ox or horse, a sickle for cutting grain, a flail for threshing, a wooden shovel for turning soil. These implements were passed down through generations, repaired countless times, and guarded jealously. The loss of a plow or a draft animal could mean the difference between subsistence and starvation. During wartime, soldiers often took these tools as spoils of war, leaving families with no means to work their land. Then came the taxes. War demanded silver, and silver came from the poor. Dozens of creative ways were invented to gather coin. Hearth taxes, salt duties, bridge tolls, wine levies, marriage fees. If you could not pay, the local bailiff might take your oxen or your last pig. If that wasn't enough, your land might be seized. It didn't matter that your family had worked it for generations. To the crown, it was just a line in a ledger. The tax collectors arrived like ravens, dressed in official colors and carrying scrolls sealed with wax. They moved from house to house with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. They knew exactly what each family owned, down to the last chicken and the smallest pot. They had been watching, making lists, calculating what could be taken without quite causing a revolt. The hearth tax was particularly cruel because it taxed the very means of survival. Every fireplace, every cooking pit, every source of warmth became a liability. Families huddled around single fires, sharing heat and light, while the tax collectors counted chimneys and calculated profits. The salt tax made food preservation nearly impossible. Salt was essential for keeping meat and fish from spoiling, but the levy made it so expensive that many families had to choose between seasoning their food and paying their other obligations. Bridge tolls and road taxes trapped communities in cycles of poverty. The very infrastructure that might have allowed trade and prosperity became a source of revenue for distant lords. A farmer hoping to sell his grain at market might find that the tolls consumed all his potential profit. The marriage fees were perhaps the most bitter of all, turning love and hope into sources of revenue for the crown. Young couples had to choose between poverty and loneliness, between starting families and meeting their obligations to distant rulers. The collection itself was a form of violence. Bailiffs arrived with armed men, making it clear that resistance was futile. They took inventory with the coldness of undertakers, cataloging possessions and calculating values. A family's entire life could be reduced to a few lines in a ledger. 1 cow, 2 pigs, 3 chickens, assorted household goods. When the animals were led away, children cried and mothers wept, but the bailiffs remained unmoved. They had quotas to meet and masters to satisfy. Even more terrifying were the rowdiers, drifting groups of mercenaries and former soldiers with no battle left to fight and no wages to collect. They roamed from village to village, armed and dangerous. Some stole openly. Others pretended to be messengers or guards. For the average villager, it made no difference. Your food vanished, your home was ransacked, and no one came to help. These men were the war's forgotten casualties, soldiers who had served their purpose and been discarded. They had learned to kill and destroy, but they had no place in peacetime society. Many had come from other lands, following promises of glory and profit that had never materialized. They spoke different languages, and followed different customs, but they shared a common desperation that made them dangerous to everyone they encountered. The rowdiers traveled in groups that might number anywhere from a dozen to several hundred. They had their own codes and hierarchies, their own ways of dividing spoils and settling disputes. They were not quite brigands because they maintained some semblance of military organization, but they were not quite soldiers because they served no legitimate authority. They existed in a gray space between war and peace, predators who fed on the weakness of others. When word spread that rowdiers were approaching, villages had few options. Flight was possible, but meant abandoning everything you had worked to build. Resistance was usually futile, because these men were experienced fighters with real weapons and armor. Negotiation sometimes worked, but it required giving up food and valuables that families could not afford to lose. Most often, people simply hid and hoped the storm would pass. The rowdiers took more than just material possessions. They shattered the social fabric that held communities together. Trust between neighbors eroded when survival was at stake. Traditional authorities lost their power when they could not provide protection. The bonds of kinship and mutual obligation that had sustained rural life for centuries began to fray under the pressure of constant threat. Young women faced particular dangers when armed men roamed the countryside. Families went to extraordinary lengths to hide their daughters, disguising them as boys or sending them to distant relatives. The fear was not just of immediate violence, but of the long-term consequences that would follow. A woman who had been dishonored might never find a husband, condemning her to a life of poverty and isolation. The rowdiers also carried disease with them as they moved from place to place. They had no fixed homes, no regular sources of clean water, no means of maintaining the basic hygiene that might have prevented the spread of illness. Their camps were breeding grounds for pestilence, and every village they visited risked contamination. Then came the plague. By the middle of the 14th century, the Black Death moved quietly through the countryside. It did not shout. It crept in like fog, invisible and devastating. The fields grew quiet. The ovens stayed cold. Entire hamlets disappeared, not with fire or war, but with silence. The cycle of planting and harvest was broken. No one came to collect the dead. No one rang the bells. What remained was stillness, heavy and unnatural. The plague arrived without warning, carried by travelers who seemed healthy when they entered a village, but who sickened and died within days. It spread through families like wildfire, taking parents and children, grandparents and infants, with equal ferocity. The symptoms were terrible to witness. The fever that burned like fire, the swollen lymph nodes that gave the disease its name, the delirium that robbed victims of their reason in their final hours. Traditional remedies proved useless against this new enemy. Herbs that had healed other ailments had no effect on the plague. Prayers that had brought comfort in other times of trouble seemed to go unanswered. The very institutions that people relied on for guidance and support began to crumble as priests and healers succumbed to the same disease that claimed their parishioners. Death came so quickly and claimed so many that the normal rituals of mourning became impossible. Bodies piled up faster than graves could be dug. The tradition of wakes and funeral masses gave way to mass burials and hurried disposals. The careful ceremonies that had helped communities cope with loss were abandoned in the face of overwhelming mortality. Families were torn apart in ways that went beyond simple death. Children were orphaned when their parents died, but no relatives remained to care for them. Elderly people were left alone when their adult children succumbed to the plague. Marriages were dissolved not by choice, but by the simple fact that one partner died while the other survived. The social structures that had given meaning and stability to life collapsed under the weight of so much loss. The economic impact was as devastating as the human cost. Fields went unplanted because there was no one left to work them. Livestock wandered free because their owners had died. Mills and workshops fell silent because the skilled workers who operated them had succumbed to the plague. The complex network of trade and exchange that had sustained rural communities simply ceased to function. Survivors faced impossible choices. A widow with young children might have to choose between staying in a village where she knew everyone was dead and venturing into the unknown in search of shelter and safety. A farmer who had lost his entire family might have to decide whether to continue working land that held only memories of loss or to abandon everything and start over elsewhere. Plague also changed the relationship between the living and the dead. Cemeteries overflowed, forcing communities to create new burial grounds or resort to mass graves. The careful attention that had previously been paid to the resting places of ancestors became impossible to maintain. The very landscape was scarred by the epidemic, marked by hastily dug graves and abandoned settlements. Some communities tried to isolate themselves, refusing to allow strangers to enter and posting guards to keep out potential carriers of the disease. But the plague seemed to find its way everywhere, carried by vermin and spread by contact that was impossible to prevent entirely. The measures that might have worked against human enemies proved useless against an invisible foe. Religious faith, which had provided comfort and explanation for so many hardships, was tested to its limits by the plague. Why would God allow such suffering? Why were the innocent punished alongside the guilty? Why did prayer and penance seem to have no effect on the course of the disease? Some people turned to extreme forms of religious devotion, believing that greater sacrifice might earn divine protection. Others lost faith entirely, concluding that the world was governed by chance rather than divine providence. The plague also created opportunities for those who survived. Land that had been carefully divided among many families suddenly became available to the few who remained. Skilled craftsmen who had previously competed for work found themselves in high demand. Young people who might have spent years working for their parents inherited property and responsibility at an early age. But these opportunities came at a cost that few would have chosen to pay. And yet the war continued. It paused at times. Treaties were signed, talks were held, but the fighting always resumed. When the soldiers returned, they marched past villages that had barely recovered and left them worse than before. The truces that interrupted the fighting were often more cruel than the war itself, because they raised hopes that were inevitably dashed. Families began to rebuild their lives, replant their fields, and restore their communities, only to see their efforts destroyed when hostilities resumed. A cycle of destruction and reconstruction became a form of torture, wearing down the spirit as much as the body. During the brief periods of peace, tax collectors still came. The armies that were not fighting still needed to be fed and equipped. The costs of war continued even when the actual fighting had stopped. In some ways, the truces were more expensive than the battles because they allowed both sides to prepare for the next round of conflict. The treaties themselves were negotiated by people who had never seen a battlefield, never watched their crops burn, never buried their children. They were signed in comfortable rooms by men who wore fine clothes and ate rich food, while the common people whose lives hung in the balance were not even consulted. The terms of these agreements often had little to do with the realities of life for ordinary people and everything to do with the ambitions of distant rulers. When the fighting resumed, it was often more brutal than before. Soldiers who had been idle during the truce were eager to return to the field. New weapons and tactics had been developed during the pause, making the next round of conflict more deadly than the last. The brief taste of peace made the return to war all the more bitter. Still, the peasants endured. They patched leaky roofs with bundles of reeds. They sold firewood and eggs. They married, raised children, and passed down old songs. Their names were rarely recorded, but they carried on, day after day, year after year. The resilience of common people in the face of overwhelming hardship was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire period. Families that had lost everything somehow found the strength to begin again. Communities that had been shattered by war and plague slowly rebuilt themselves. The basic human activities of love, work, and hope continued despite conditions that should have crushed the human spirit entirely. Children were born and raised even in the midst of chaos. Parents somehow found ways to teach their sons and daughters the skills they would need to survive, passing down not just practical knowledge, but also the values and traditions that gave meaning to life. Young people fell in love and married, creating new families and new reasons to hope for the future. The oral tradition that preserved the stories and songs of the people became more important than ever during these dark times. When books were rare and literacy was limited, the ability to remember and retell the old tales was what kept the culture alive. Grandparents who had survived multiple wars and plagues became living libraries, repositories of wisdom and experience that could not be destroyed by any army. Women played crucial roles in maintaining community life during the war. They tended the sick, prepared the dead for burial, and kept households functioning when the men were away fighting. They preserved food, managed resources, and made the countless small decisions that allowed families to survive from day to day. Their contributions were rarely acknowledged in official records, but they were essential to the continuity of life. The skills that had been passed down through generations took on new importance during the war. Knowing how to preserve food could mean the difference between life and death during a long siege. Understanding which plants could be used for medicine became crucial when professional healers were unavailable. The ability to repair tools and clothing with limited resources was what allowed families to maintain their independence. Trade networks that had been disrupted by the war slowly began to function again, often in new and creative ways. Merchants who had lost their regular routes found alternative paths to market. Craftsmen who had been displaced by the fighting established new workshops in safer locations. The human urge to exchange goods and services proved stronger than the forces that tried to destroy it. Local markets became more than just places to buy and sell goods. They were centers of communication where people could share news, seek help, and maintain the social connections that gave their lives meaning. A market day might be the only time in a month when members of scattered communities could come together, reinforcing the bonds that held society together. Religious observances also adapted to the new realities of life during the war. When churches were destroyed, people gathered in homes for prayer and worship. When priests were unavailable, lay people led services and provided spiritual guidance. The forms of religious practice changed, but the underlying faith that sustained people through their trials remained strong. And sometimes, beauty slipped in. A still afternoon under the trees, the smell of new bread rising in a clay oven, a village dance where someone played a tune on a wooden pipe, and for a short while, everyone forgot the war. These moments of grace were all the more precious because they were so rare and unexpected. A sunset that painted the sky in brilliant colors could lift the spirits of people who had almost forgotten what beauty looked like. The laughter of children at play could remind adults that joy was still possible, even in the darkest times. The sound of singing voices raised together could create a sense of community that transcended the hardships of daily life. The changing seasons still brought their own forms of beauty, even in wartime. Spring flowers bloomed in abandoned fields, reclaiming the land that had been scarred by battle. Summer brought warmth and light that could not be entirely suppressed by human conflict. Autumn painted the leaves in colors that reminded people of the world's natural splendor. Winter covered the ugliness of war with a blanket of snow that made everything seem clean and new. Couples still found ways to celebrate their weddings, even if the ceremonies were simpler than in peacetime. Friends and neighbors gathered to share what little they had, creating feasts from meager resources and finding joy in the simple fact of being together. Musicians played traditional songs that connected the present moment to a longer history of human celebration. The birth of a child was always a cause for celebration, but during the war, it took on special significance. A new baby represented hope for the future, a sign that life would continue despite all the forces aligned against it. The rituals surrounding birth and naming became more important than ever, connecting the child to the community and the larger human story. Harvest festivals continued even when the harvests were meager. People gathered to share what little they had managed to grow and to give thanks for their survival. These celebrations were acts of defiance against the despair that threatened to overwhelm them, statements of faith in the basic goodness of life. Then the soldiers came again, then the taxman returned. The cycle seemed endless, but it was not without meaning. Each time the people rebuilt, they did so with greater skill and determination. Each time they faced new challenges, they drew on the wisdom gained from previous struggles. The war that was meant to destroy them instead revealed the depths of human resilience and the power of community to overcome even the most overwhelming obstacles. The physical landscape itself bore witness to the suffering of these forgotten generations. Ancient forests that had stood for centuries were cleared to fuel the forges that made weapons and armor. The great oaks that had provided acorns in lean years were felled to build siege engines and castle walls. Streams that had once run clear became polluted with the runoff from military camps and the debris of battle. The very earth seemed to absorb the pain of those who worked it, as if the soil itself had been wounded by the endless cycle of violence. Roads that had once connected communities became arteries of war. The old Roman paths that had carried merchants and pilgrims now bore the weight of cannon and the tramp of marching feet. Bridges that had been built to unite became choke points where armies could control the movement of people and goods. The infrastructure of peace was transformed into the machinery of conflict, turning the tools of civilization against itself. Villages developed their own forms of intelligence networks, systems of communication that could warn of approaching danger without relying on official channels. A column of smoke rising from a distant hill might signal the approach of soldiers. The flight of birds could indicate the movement of large groups across the countryside. Children learned to read these signs as naturally as they learned to walk, becoming scouts and messengers in a war that had no front lines and recognized no non-combatants. The craft of survival became an art form in itself. Peasant families learned to hide their valuables in ways that would fool even experienced searchers. They dug secret chambers beneath their floors, concealed caches in the walls of their houses, and buried their most precious possessions in locations that only they could find. The ability to make something valuable appear worthless became a skill that could save lives. Food preservation took on new urgency when the next meal was never guaranteed. Women became experts at smoking meat with whatever materials they could find, creating jerky that could last for months. They learned to ferment vegetables in ways that would keep them edible through the longest winters. The art of brewing became not just a source of nutrition, but a way to purify water that might otherwise carry disease. Every scrap of food was precious. Every technique for extending its life was vital knowledge. The rhythm of agricultural life adapted to the realities of constant threat. Farmers learned to plant crops that could be harvested quickly if soldiers were approaching. They favored varieties that could be hidden easily or that appeared less valuable to casual observers. The ancient practice of leaving some fields fallow was abandoned in favor of intensive cultivation that could maximize yield in minimum time. The long-term health of the soil was sacrificed for the immediate need to survive. Clothing became both protection and camouflage. Peasants learned to dress in ways that would not attract attention from passing soldiers. Bright colors were avoided in favor of drab browns and grays that would blend into the landscape. Women concealed jewelry and decorative items that might tempt thieves. The fashion of the common people evolved toward practicality and invisibility, as standing out in any way could prove dangerous. The social hierarchy of village life became more fluid during the war years. Traditional authorities lost their power when they could not provide protection or maintain order. New leaders emerged based on their ability to organize defense, negotiate with soldiers, or find resources during times of scarcity. Age and gender became less important than competence and courage. A young woman who could successfully hide a village's food stores might gain more respect than an elderly man who had inherited his position. Language itself adapted to the realities of war. New words entered the vocabulary of common people, terms borrowed from soldiers and officials who spoke different tongues. The ability to communicate with foreign mercenaries could mean the difference between survival and destruction. Children grew up multilingual by necessity, learning phrases in English, French, and the various dialects of the mercenary companies that roamed the countryside. The calendar of religious observances was disrupted by the constant threat of violence. Holy days that had once brought communities together became dangerous gatherings that might attract unwanted attention. The traditional pilgrimage routes that had connected villages to larger centers of worship were abandoned as too risky to travel. Faith became more personal and private, practiced in the safety of homes rather than the vulnerability of public spaces. Medical knowledge expanded out of necessity as traditional healers were killed or driven away by the war. Ordinary people learned to treat wounds, set broken bones, and grew remedies from whatever plants they could find. The distinction between herbalist and housewife blurred, as survival required everyone to become their own physician. Knowledge that had once been specialized became common currency, passed from neighbor to neighbor like recipes or farming techniques. The care of animals became more complex when livestock represented not just food, but also targets for theft. Farmers learned to camouflage their animals, dyeing the coats of valuable horses to make them appear less desirable. They developed hiding places for their flocks and herds, secret pastures, where animals could graze safely away from the main roads. The ancient bond between humans and their domestic animals deepened as both species depended on each other for survival. Sleep itself became a luxury that few could afford in full. Families learned to post watches through the night, taking turns listening for the sounds that might indicate approaching danger. The ability to wake instantly at the first sign of trouble became a survival skill. Children grew up accustomed to being roused from sleep and moved to hiding places without complaint or confusion. The natural rhythm of rest and activity was subordinated to the demands of constant vigilance. The marriage customs that had governed rural life for centuries were transformed by the pressures of war. Young people could not afford to wait for the traditional courtship periods when death might come at any moment. Weddings became simpler affairs, focused on the practical business of creating new households, rather than the elaborate celebrations of peacetime. The exchange of vows often took place in secret, without the community celebrations that had once marked such occasions. Even the education of children changed to meet the demands of survival. Boys learned not just farming techniques, but also the skills needed to fight or flee. Girls were taught not just domestic arts, but also the crafts of concealment and deception. The innocent games of childhood gave way to training exercises that prepared young people for the harsh realities they would face. The knowledge that had once been preserved in books was now transmitted through direct experience, hard-won wisdom passed from generation to generation. The very concept of home became more fluid as families were forced to move repeatedly to escape violence. The deep roots that had once connected people to specific places were severed by the necessities of survival. Entire communities might relocate several times during the course of the war, carrying their culture and traditions with them like portable treasures. The skills needed to establish new settlements quickly became as important as the knowledge of how to maintain old ones. Trade relationships that had been stable for generations were disrupted by the chaos of war. The merchant networks that had connected rural communities to urban centers were broken by the dangers of travel and the destruction of infrastructure. New forms of commerce emerged, based on barter rather than currency, conducted in secret rather than in public markets. The economy of the countryside became more localized and self-sufficient by necessity. The storytelling traditions that had entertained and educated people for centuries adapted to reflect the new realities of life during wartime. Old tales were retold with new meanings, ancient heroes recast as models for survival rather than glory. New stories emerged from the experiences of war, accounts of courage and endurance that would be passed down long after the fighting had ended. The oral tradition that preserved the culture of the people became more important than ever as a source of comfort and inspiration. The measurement of time itself changed during the war years. The ancient calendar based on agricultural cycles was supplemented by new ways of marking time. The years since the last major battle, the seasons since the village had been burned, the months since the last harvest. Memory became organized around trauma rather than celebration, with each family maintaining their own private chronology of losses and survivals. The relationship between the living and the natural world deepened as people were forced to depend more directly on the resources of the earth. Knowledge of wild plants and animals became crucial for survival when cultivated crops were destroyed. The ability to read weather patterns and natural signs became more important than ever when planning activities that might mean the difference between life and death. The boundaries between human and natural worlds blurred as people learned to live more like their ancestors had lived centuries before. The story of the peasants during the 100 Years' War is ultimately a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They found ways to maintain their humanity in the face of inhumanity. They preserved their culture despite efforts to destroy it. They kept hope alive when hope seemed impossible. Their legacy lives on in the villages that still dot the countryside, in the traditions that have been passed down through generations, and in the knowledge that human beings can endure almost anything when they support one another. The war that was supposed to determine the fate of kingdoms instead revealed the true strength of the human spirit. The techniques of survival that were developed during these dark years would influence rural life for centuries to come. The self-reliance that was forced upon communities by the breakdown of central authority became a permanent feature of country life. The skills of concealment and deception that were learned during the war would be passed down through generations, becoming part of the cultural heritage of the countryside. The knowledge of how to endure when formal institutions failed would prove valuable in many future crises. The children who grew up during the war years carried with them a different understanding of the world than their parents had possessed. They had learned from infancy that security was temporary, that authority was fragile, and that survival depended on their own resourcefulness rather than the protection of others. This hard-won wisdom would shape their approach to life long after the fighting had ended, making them more cautious, but also more resilient than earlier generations. The women who had taken on new roles during the war years would not easily return to their former positions when peace was restored. Having proven their ability to lead communities, manage resources, and make life and death decisions, they had gained a confidence and competence that would not be easily suppressed. The war had challenged traditional gender roles in ways that would have lasting effects on rural society. The bonds between communities that had been forged in the crucible of shared suffering would prove stronger than the old ties based on proximity and tradition. Villages that had helped each other survive the war years would maintain their alliances long after the immediate danger had passed. The networks of mutual aid that had developed during the crisis would become permanent features of rural life, creating new forms of solidarity that transcended the boundaries of individual settlements. Now we leave this life behind and turn toward something very different. A life shaped not by farming or tolls, but by visions and voices. While peasants struggled to survive in their muddy fields and leaking cottages, praying for nothing more than another day of life, somewhere in the eastern reaches of France, a young woman was beginning to experience something that would change everything. She claimed to hear the divine speaking directly to her, calling her to a purpose that would lift her far above the humble station of her birth. Her name was Joan, and the voices that spoke to her would soon echo across battlefields and throne rooms, transforming not just her own destiny, but the fate of two kingdoms. The girl who had once tended sheep would soon be leading armies, and the war that had ground on for so long would finally find its turning point in the most unlikely of heroes. Imagine the silence of a small village at night. The wind moves gently through the trees, and somewhere a stream gurgles over stones. The year is 1425, and we are in Domremy, a quiet town near the border of France and the Holy Roman Empire. In a modest farmhouse, a teenage girl named Joan is beginning to hear something she cannot explain. She says it is the voice of Saint Michael. Later, she will mention Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret. These voices speak not in riddles, but with clarity. They tell her to remain pure. They tell her to help the Dauphin, the rightful heir to the French throne. They tell her to save France. She is just 13. The France of Joan's youth was a realm fractured beyond recognition. The 100 Years' War had torn through the countryside like a plague, leaving behind burned villages, orphaned children, and fields that had forgotten the touch of the plow. English armies occupied vast territories in the north, while Burgundian forces held sway in the east. The legitimate king, Charles VI, had died in 1422, leaving behind a mad legacy and a disputed succession. His son, the Dauphin Charles, controlled little more than the territories south of the Loire River, earning him the mocking title of King of Bourges. In this chaos, ordinary people suffered most. Mercenary companies roamed the countryside, owing allegiance to no crown save profit. They burned what they could not steal and stole what they could not burn. Tax collectors arrived in the wake of armies, demanding payment from peasants who had already lost everything. The very concept of France as a unified nation seemed ready to dissolve into the mists of history. Yet in Domremy, life continued with a stubborn persistence that would later seem prophetic. The village sat strategically on the banks of the Meuse River, technically loyal to the Dauphin, but surrounded by Burgundian territory. Joan's father, Jacques d'Arc, was a man of modest means who held the position of village constable. Her mother, Isabelle Romy, was known for her deep piety and frequent pilgrimages to local shrines. The family was neither wealthy nor destitute, occupying that middle ground of rural life where survival depended on hard work, community cooperation, and an unwavering faith in God's providence. Joan herself was remarkable only in her ordinariness. She could not read or write, skills unnecessary for a peasant girl whose future lay in marriage and motherhood. She tended sheep, spun wool, and helped with the endless tasks that kept a medieval household functioning. Her friends later remembered her as devout but not unusually so, charitable but not saintly. She attended Mass regularly, confessed her sins, and showed particular devotion to the Virgin Mary. Nothing in her early years suggested the extraordinary destiny that awaited her. The voices began as whispers in the garden behind her family's home. Saint Michael appeared first, she later testified, as a figure of tremendous beauty and power, surrounded by angels. His message was simple yet overwhelming. She had been chosen by God to restore France to its rightful king. The command seemed impossible, absurd even. What could a peasant girl from an insignificant village possibly do to change the course of kingdoms? At first, she says nothing. The voices continue for years. Then, in 1428, she decides to act. With her uncle's help, she travels to meet the local commander. She is turned away, but she returns. Each time, she is more certain. The commander she sought was Robert de Baudricourt, captain of the royal garrison at Vaucouleurs. To him, Joan was nothing more than a deluded peasant girl, another victim of the religious hysteria that periodically swept through war-torn regions. He dismissed her curtly, telling her uncle to take her home and give her a sound beating. But Joan possessed a quality that would define her entire brief career, an absolute certainty that brooked no argument and recognized no impossibility. She returned to Vaucouleurs again and again throughout the winter of 1428 and into 1429. each time. She spoke with greater confidence about her divine mission. She made specific predictions about military disasters that subsequently came true. She spoke of secret matters concerning the Dauphin's legitimacy with an authority that seemed to transcend her humble origins. Gradually, her persistence began to have an effect. Local merchants, minor nobles, and even some of Agincourt's own men began to listen. The siege of Orleans provided the crucial context for Joan's emergence onto the stage of history. The English had been besieging the city since October 1428, slowly tightening their grip on the last major stronghold, defending the approaches to the Dauphin's territories. If Orleans fell, the road to Bourges would lie open, and with it, the effective end of Valois resistance. The city's defenders, led by Jean de Dunois, were running short of supplies and hope in equal measure. News of the siege's desperate situation reached even remote villages like Domremy. Joan began to speak more urgently of her mission, claiming that she had seen in visions the suffering of Orleans and the joy of its eventual liberation. She spoke of raising the siege, of leading the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation, of driving the English from French soil. To skeptics, these seemed like the fantasies of a girl who had heard too many stories of ancient heroes. To believers, they carried the ring of prophecy. The transformation in Joan's appearance during this period was as remarkable as her growing confidence. She cut her hair short in the fashion of a male page, adopted men's clothing, and began to carry herself with a bearing that suggested military rather than domestic training. This was no mere disguise, but a fundamental alteration of identity. She was becoming something new, something that had no precise precedent in medieval society. A woman who claimed direct divine authorization to exercise temporal power. Eventually, she is granted an audience with the Dauphin Charles. He is in hiding, unsure of his future, his throne uncertain. She arrives in men's clothing, wearing simple black and gray, with short hair and steady eyes. The court watches her with a mixture of amusement and suspicion. The court at Chinon was a place of faded grandeur and barely concealed desperation. The Dauphin Charles VII was a man haunted by doubts about his own legitimacy. His mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, had publicly questioned his paternity, suggesting that he might be the bastard son of one of her lovers, rather than the rightful heir to the throne. This uncertainty gnawed at Charles, making him hesitant to assert his claims too boldly, lest they be proven false. The nobles who surrounded Charles were a mixture of loyal supporters and opportunistic survivors. Many had lost vast estates to English occupation and saw service to the Dauphin as their only hope of eventual restoration. Others were refugees from the Burgundian territories, men and women who had watched their former allies align with foreign invaders. The court was poor by the standards of medieval monarchy, forced to move frequently to avoid English raids, depended on loans from Italian bankers, and the grudging support of towns that remained loyal, more from habit than conviction. Into this atmosphere of uncertainty and decline came Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl who claimed to speak with the voice of heaven itself. The very audacity of her appearance was breathtaking. Medieval society was built on rigid hierarchies that defined everyone's place from birth to death. Peasants did not presume to advise kings. Women did not claim military authority. Children did not reshape the destiny of nations. Yet here was Joan, violating every convention with a serenity that suggested she was unaware of having transgressed any boundaries at all. To test her, Charles hides in the crowd and sends another man to sit on the throne. Joan walks past the impostor without hesitation and kneels before the true Dauphin. She tells him things he believes no one else could know. The test at Chinon has become legendary, though the exact details remain disputed. What seems certain is that Joan demonstrated knowledge that convinced Charles of her supernatural insights. Some historians suggest she revealed details about his private prayers or his doubts about his legitimacy. Others propose that she shared strategic information about English plans that she could not have known through normal means. Whatever the specifics, the encounter transformed Charles from a skeptic into a believer. The examination of Joan that followed was exhaustive and humiliating. Churchmen questioned her for hours about her visions, her voices, and her claims to divine mission. They subjected her to physical examination to verify her claimed virginity, a prerequisite for the kind of spiritual authority she asserted. Theologians at the University of Poitiers debated whether her mission was divinely inspired or demonically influenced. The process took weeks, during which Joan displayed a theological sophistication that amazed learned clerics. Her answers during these interrogations revealed a mind that was both simple and profound. When asked about complex doctrinal questions, she would often respond with practical wisdom that cut through academic subtlety. When pressed about the nature of her voices, she described them with the matter-of-fact precision of someone recounting a conversation with a neighbor. Her faith was not the product of theological study, but of direct experience, and this gave her a confidence that no amount of learning could shake. He decides to let her lead an army. She is 17. The decision to give Joan military command was as radical as it was desperate. Medieval warfare was the exclusive domain of the warrior aristocracy, men who had trained from childhood in the arts of combat and strategy. The idea of placing a peasant girl in charge of seasoned knights violated every principle of military organization. Yet Charles had few alternatives. His previous commanders had achieved little beyond preserving what remained of his diminishing realm. Perhaps divine intervention was worth the risk. The army that Joan was given was a reflection of the Dauphin's straitened circumstances. It consisted largely of rowdiers, professional soldiers who fought for pay rather than feudal obligation. Many were little better than brigands, men who had learned their trade in the endless skirmishes that plagued the countryside. They were supplemented by urban militias from towns still loyal to the Valois cause, craftsmen and merchants who had taken up arms to protect their communities. The noble contingent was small but significant. Younger sons and dispossessed lords who saw in Joan's mission a chance to reclaim their lost fortunes. Joan's preparation for military command was as unconventional as her appointment. She spent hours in prayer, seeking guidance from her voices about strategy and tactics. She insisted on rigorous moral standards for her troops, forbidding swearing, gambling, and the companionship of camp followers. She attended Mass daily and encouraged her soldiers to do the same. To veteran campaigners, these requirements seemed like the whims of a naive girl. To Joan, they were essential preparations for a divinely sanctioned mission. She does not fight with a sword. She carries a banner, white linen painted with images of saints. In battle, she rides with the troops, calling for courage and mercy. Her presence alone changes the mood. Morale rises. The French army, tired and splintered, begins to believe again. The banner became Joan's most recognizable symbol, a piece of white linen that fluttered above the chaos of medieval battlefields like a promise of divine protection. It bore the image of Christ in judgment, flanked by angels with the words Jesus Maria embroidered in gold thread. Joan claimed that her voices had described the banner's design in precise detail, down to the colors and positioning of the figures. She carried it herself into battle, refusing to delegate this responsibility to a standard bearer. The psychological impact of Joan's presence on the battlefield was immediate and profound. Medieval warfare was as much about morale as about weapons and tactics. Soldiers who believed they were fighting for a righteous cause, with divine backing, would press attacks that seemed hopeless, endure privations that would normally break lesser men, and maintain cohesion in the face of devastating losses. Joan's banner became a rallying point that transformed dispirited rowdiers into something approaching crusaders. Her tactical innovations were as important as her inspirational presence. Joan favored aggressive assault over the cautious maneuvering that had characterized French strategy for decades. She insisted on direct attacks against English fortifications, counting on speed and surprise to overcome superior defensive positions. Her approach was costly in terms of casualties, but it achieved results that more conventional strategies had failed to deliver. The English, accustomed to facing demoralized French forces, found themselves confronting enemies who fought with reckless determination. At Orleans, the tide turns. Joan's strategies, along with her determination, lead to a critical French victory. More follow. Eventually, Charles is crowned King of France in Reims, just as Joan had promised. The siege of Orleans was broken in 4 days of continuous fighting that would reshape the course of the 100 Years' War. Joan's arrival in the city on April 29, 1429, was greeted with scenes of religious fervor that bordered on hysteria. The defenders, who had been preparing for surrender, suddenly found themselves infused with an energy that seemed to transcend mere military enthusiasm. They attacked English positions that had been considered impregnable, scaling walls under devastating fire and overwhelming defensive works through sheer audacity. The English response to Joan's appearance revealed their own uncertainty about how to interpret her. Some dismissed her as a French propaganda trick, a clever piece of theater designed to boost enemy morale. Others were clearly unsettled by reports of her supernatural abilities and the religious devotion she inspired. The English command structure, which had operated with mechanical efficiency for decades, began to show signs of confusion and division. The lifting of the siege was followed by a series of victories that opened the road to Reims. Joan's forces captured Jargeau, defeated the English at Patay, and cleared the Loire Valley of enemy strongholds. Each success reinforced her reputation for invincibility and attracted more recruits to her banner. French towns that had remained neutral or even collaborated with the English began to declare for the Dauphin. The political map of France was being redrawn with shocking speed. The coronation at Reims Cathedral on July 17, 1429, was the culmination of Joan's mission and the beginning of her downfall. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of medieval pageantry, designed to legitimize Charles's kingship through ancient ritual and divine sanction. Joan stood beside the newly crowned king, her banner prominently displayed, her presence a visible reminder of the supernatural forces that had made his triumph possible. But politics are colder than faith. Once Charles is crowned, he begins to distance himself from her. Her victories have made her famous. Some whisper that she is dangerous. Others call her a heretic. To the English, she is a symbol of rebellion. To some in the church, she is a girl who dared speak to heaven without permission. The transformation in Joan's position after the coronation was swift and brutal. As long as Charles had needed her military success, he had been willing to tolerate her unconventional behavior and extraordinary claims. But once he was crowned king, her continued presence became problematic. A monarch who owed his throne to a peasant girl's visions was hardly the image of legitimate authority that Charles wished to project. The court nobles who had initially supported Joan began to view her with suspicion and resentment. Her humble origins, which had once seemed to validate her divine mission, now appeared to threaten the social order that supported their own positions. Her influence over the king and her popularity with common soldiers created a power base that existed outside traditional feudal structures. To men who had spent their lives learning to navigate the complex hierarchies of medieval society, Joan represented an unpredictable and potentially dangerous force. Religious authorities faced an even more complex dilemma. Joan's success suggested that her claims to divine inspiration were genuine, but her independence from ecclesiastical control was deeply troubling. The medieval church had spent centuries establishing its monopoly on communication with the divine. Saints might receive visions, but they were expected to submit these experiences to clerical interpretation and authority. Joan's insistence on direct divine guidance, combined with her refusal to accept limitations on her mission, placed her in potential conflict with church doctrine. The military situation also contributed to Joan's declining influence. Her strategy of aggressive assault had achieved spectacular initial results, but it was inherently unsustainable. The English had learned to adapt to her tactics, strengthening their defenses and avoiding the kind of pitched battles where French enthusiasm could overcome superior organization. The war settled into a pattern of siege and counter-siege that favored the side with better resources and more professional soldiers. In 1430, she is captured by the Burgundians, allies of the English. She is handed over in exchange for silver. Charles does not ransom her. The same court that welcomed her now leaves her behind. Joan's capture at Compiègne was the result of a carefully planned Burgundian operation designed to eliminate the most potent symbol of French resistance. The siege of Compiègne had become a test of wills between the various factions fighting for control of northern France. Joan's decision to personally lead a sortie against the besiegers was characteristic of her aggressive approach to warfare, but it also reflected a growing desperation as her influence waned and her military options dwindled. The moment of her capture was witnessed by soldiers from both sides and quickly became the stuff of legend. Joan had been covering the retreat of her men when her horse was brought down by Burgundian crossbow bolts. Surrounded and outnumbered, she continued to fight until overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Even her enemies acknowledged the courage she displayed in her final free moments, though they would show her little mercy in the months that followed. The decision to sell Joan to the English was made by John of Luxembourg, who held her as his prisoner under the complex web of feudal obligations that governed medieval warfare. The sum involved was substantial 10,000 livres tournois, but the political implications were even more significant. By transferring Joan to English custody, the Burgundians were ensuring that she would never again pose a threat to their alliance with the occupying power. Charles VII's failure to ransom Joan has been debated by historians for centuries. Some argue that he lacked the financial resources to match the English offer. Others suggest that he had concluded that Joan's usefulness was at an end, and that her continued presence would only complicate his efforts to negotiate a lasting peace. The most charitable interpretation is that he was poorly informed about the negotiations and acted too late to intervene. Whatever the truth, his abandonment of Joan represented a brutal calculation that political necessity outweighed personal loyalty. She is imprisoned in Rouen and placed on trial by an ecclesiastical court. The charges are many: heresy, witchcraft, dressing as a man. Rouen in 1431 was a city transformed by decades of English occupation. The ancient capital of Normandy had been thoroughly anglicized, its French nobility replaced by English administrators and merchants. The cathedral where Joan would be tried was itself a symbol of the cultural conquest that had accompanied military victory. English bishops occupied positions once held by French clerics, while English lawyers interpreted canon law through the lens of political necessity. The trial that began in January 1431 was a judicial proceeding only in the most technical sense. The verdict had been predetermined before the first witness was called. Joan was to be found guilty of heresy and witchcraft, charges that would justify her execution, while simultaneously discrediting the king she had helped to crown. If Joan was a heretic, then Charles VII was a king crowned by demonic influence, and his claim to the throne was invalid. The presiding judge was Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, a man whose career had been built on collaboration with the English occupation. Cauchon was a skilled ecclesiastical lawyer who understood exactly what was expected of him. He had been promised the Archbishopric of Rouen as a reward for his services, a promotion that would crown a lifetime of political maneuvering. The other judges were a mixture of English appointees and French collaborators, men who had cast their lot with the occupying power and needed Joan's condemnation to validate their own choices. The charges against Joan revealed the careful legal strategy that Cauchon had developed. Heresy was the most serious accusation, carrying the death penalty and providing theological justification for her execution. Witchcraft was included to explain her military successes and to discredit her claims to divine inspiration. The charge of dressing as a man was technically a violation of canon law, but it also served to emphasize her defiance of natural order and social convention. The courtroom is not a place of justice. She is questioned for hours at a time, with no legal counsel. She is exhausted, isolated, and ill, yet she answers with clarity. Often, her words confound the judges. When asked if she is in God's grace, she replies, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may He keep me." It is an answer both faithful and cautious. The trial proceedings, meticulously recorded by court scribes, reveal the full extent of Joan's intellectual and spiritual strength. Despite her youth, her lack of education, and her desperate circumstances, she consistently outmaneuvered questioners who had spent their lives studying theology and law. Her responses demonstrated a grasp of doctrinal subtleties that amazed even her enemies, while her steadfast refusal to renounce her divine mission frustrated every attempt to break her spirit. A famous exchange about God's grace exemplified Joan's ability to find theologically sound answers to questions designed to trap her. If she had claimed to be in God's grace, she would have been guilty of the sin of presumption. If she had claimed to be outside God's grace, she would have confessed to mortal sin. Her carefully crafted response acknowledged the mystery of divine judgment while affirming her faith in God's mercy. The physical conditions of Joan's imprisonment were designed to break her will as much as the legal proceedings. She was held in a secular prison rather than an ecclesiastical one, surrounded by English soldiers who treated her with a mixture of hostility and prurient curiosity. Her cell was cold and damp, her food inadequate, her sleep interrupted by guards who watched her constantly. She was kept in chains, a humiliation reserved for the most dangerous criminals. The interrogations themselves were exercises in psychological warfare. Joan was questioned by teams of skilled theologians who worked in shifts, keeping her under pressure for hours at a time. They pursued every inconsistency in her testimony, challenged every claim she made, and subjected her words to minute analysis designed to reveal heretical implications. The sessions were conducted in Latin, a language Joan did not speak, requiring translation that further slowed proceedings and increased her confusion. Still, the verdict is decided before the trial begins. The predetermined nature of Joan's trial becomes clear when examining the procedural irregularities that marked every stage of the proceedings. Canon law required that accused heretics be tried in the diocese where their crimes were allegedly committed, but Joan was tried in Rouen for offenses supposedly committed elsewhere. She was denied the right to appeal to the Pope, a fundamental protection for anyone accused of heresy. The court refused to call witnesses who might have testified to her character and piety, while accepting testimony from accusers who had clear political motivations. The English authorities made no effort to conceal their interest in the trial's outcome. They paid the judge's expenses, provided the court with facilities, and made clear their expectations for the verdict. English soldiers guarded Joan throughout her imprisonment, and English officials attended the trial sessions as observers. The pretense of ecclesiastical independence was maintained, but the reality of political control was evident to all participants. The theological arguments presented against Joan were carefully constructed to support the desired verdict while maintaining a facade of scholarly rigor. Her claims to direct divine revelation were portrayed as evidence of spiritual pride, the most dangerous form of heresy. Her refusal to submit her visions to church authority was presented as defiance of divine order. Her adoption of male clothing was depicted as a rejection of God's plan for the sexes. Each charge was supported by citations from scripture and canon law, creating an appearance of legal scholarship that masked the political motivations underlying the prosecution. The propaganda value of Joan's trial extended far beyond the immediate goal of her execution. The English needed to demonstrate that their occupation of France was divinely sanctioned and that French resistance was inspired by demonic forces. Joan's condemnation would provide theological validation for their political claims while simultaneously discrediting Charles VII's kingship. The trial transcripts were intended to be circulated throughout Europe as evidence of English justice and French heresy. She is condemned, not for violence or betrayal, but for disobedience, for claiming direct communion with the divine, for continuing to wear men's clothing, even in prison, as a matter of safety and identity. The final verdict, delivered on May 30th, 1431, was the culmination of months of careful legal maneuvering designed to achieve a predetermined result. Joan was declared a relapsed heretic, a technical term that carried the death penalty under canon law. The accusation of relapse was based on her return to wearing male clothing after briefly adopting female dress, a decision that her judges claimed demonstrated her commitment to heretical behavior. The political significance of the charges was unmistakable. Joan was condemned not for any crime of violence or treason, but for spiritual offenses that challenged the authority of established institutions. Her claim to direct divine inspiration threatened the Church's monopoly on religious interpretation. Her adoption of male clothing violated social conventions that maintained gender hierarchies. Her refusal to submit to ecclesiastical authority represented a fundamental challenge to the medieval order. The question of Joan's male clothing had become central to the prosecution's case, precisely because it was the most visible symbol of her defiance of conventional authority. Medieval society was built on the assumption that divine will was expressed through natural order, and that natural order required the subordination of women to men. Joan's adoption of male dress was thus not merely a practical decision, but a theological statement that challenged basic assumptions about God's plan for humanity. The judge's insistence on this point revealed their understanding of the deeper issues at stake. If Joan was permitted to dress as a man while claiming divine authorization, she would be establishing a precedent that could be used by other women to challenge male authority. The very foundations of medieval society depended on the maintenance of gender hierarchies that relegated women to subordinate positions. Joan's example threatened to unleash forces that could reshape the social order in unpredictable ways. On May 30th, 1431, Joan is led into the market square of Rouen. The crowd is quiet. She is tied to a wooden post. Her white banner is placed beside her. The fire is lit. The execution took place in the Place du Vieux Marche, a square that had witnessed countless public ceremonies, but none so charged with political and religious significance. The English authorities had taken extraordinary precautions to ensure that the event proceeded according to their wishes. Soldiers surrounded the square, preventing any attempt at rescue or disruption. The crowd was carefully managed, with known sympathizers excluded and potential troublemakers closely watched. Joan's final moments were witnessed by hundreds of spectators, many of whom later provided testimony about her behavior. She appeared calm and composed, showing none of the terror that might have been expected from someone facing such a horrific death. She asked for a cross to be held before her eyes so that she might see it as she died. When a simple wooden cross was fashioned from 2 sticks and placed in her hands, she pressed it to her chest and continued to hold it even as the flames began to rise. The executioner, a man named Geoffroy Therridge, later claimed that he had been ordered to ensure that Joan died quickly, to prevent her from speaking final words that might inspire her supporters. Despite his professional expertise, he found the task more difficult than expected. Joan's calm demeanor and evident piety affected even the hardened officials whose job it was to carry out her sentence. Several witnesses reported that they saw supernatural signs during the execution, including a dove that seemed to emerge from the flames and fly toward heaven. Witnesses say she called out the name of Jesus as the flames rose. Others say she died silently. Her body is burned twice more to prevent relics from being taken. Her ashes are scattered in the Seine. The conflicting accounts of Joan's final words reflect the political tensions that surrounded her execution. English sources generally claimed that she died silently or confessed her errors, while French witnesses reported that she maintained her faith and her mission until the end. The most detailed account comes from Jean Tressard, a secretary to the English king, who claimed that Joan called out Jesus 6 times before succumbing to the flames. The decision to burn Joan's body multiple times was driven by the authorities' fear that her remains might become objects of veneration. Medieval society was deeply invested in the cult of relics, and the bones or ashes of someone widely regarded as a saint could become powerful symbols of resistance to English rule. The English had observed the way that martyrs' relics had been used to inspire rebellion in other contexts, and they were determined to prevent Joan's death from creating similar problems. The complete destruction of Joan's physical remains was intended to signal the finality of her defeat, but it actually contributed to the mystique that would surround her memory. The very extremity of the measures taken to eliminate all traces of her existence suggested that the authorities recognized the power of her example. Their obvious fear of her continued influence after death only served to reinforce the belief that she had been divinely inspired. She was 19. The bare fact of Joan's age at death encapsulates the tragedy of her brief life. In less than 2 years, she had risen from complete obscurity to become one of the most famous figures in Europe. She had changed the course of the 100 Years' War, facilitated the coronation of a king, and inspired a generation of French patriots. Yet she was still a teenager when she was led to the stake, younger than many university students, younger than most people when they begin to understand their place in the world. The contrast between Joan's youth and her extraordinary achievements became a central element of the legend that grew around her memory. Medieval society was accustomed to precocious saints and youthful martyrs, but Joan's combination of military success and spiritual authority was unprecedented. She had accomplished in months what seasoned commanders had failed to achieve in decades, and she had done so while maintaining the purity and faith that medieval Christianity demanded of its heroes. Her youth also emphasized the cruelty of her fate. The judges who condemned her were men of mature years and extensive education, ecclesiastics who had spent their lives studying theology and law. Their victory over a teenage peasant girl could hardly be seen as a triumph of justice or wisdom. Instead, it appeared to be exactly what her supporters claimed: the persecution of an innocent by corrupt authorities who feared the truth she represented. Years later, the same church that condemned her reverses its decision. In 1456, a retrial declares her innocent. In 1920, she is declared a saint. The rehabilitation of Joan of Arc began almost immediately after her death, as the political situation that had made her execution necessary began to change. The English position in France deteriorated steadily throughout the 1430s and 1440s, undermining the authority of the collaborative ecclesiastics who had conducted her trial. By 1449, Rouen itself had been recaptured by French forces, and Pierre Cauchon had fled to exile rather than face the consequences of his actions. The formal nullification trial that began in 1455 was as much a political necessity as a matter of justice. Charles VII needed to clear his legitimacy of any taint associated with Joan's condemnation as a heretic. If she had been correctly found guilty of heresy, then the king she had helped to crown was himself suspect. The retrial was thus designed to demonstrate that the original proceedings had been corrupt and that Joan had been innocent of all charges. The rehabilitation process involved extensive testimony from witnesses who had known Joan during her lifetime. Her family members, childhood friends, and military companions provided detailed accounts of her character and behavior. The resulting portrait was of a young woman of exceptional piety and virtue, whose claims to divine inspiration were supported by the miraculous success of her mission. The court found that the original trial had been conducted by judges who lacked proper jurisdiction and had violated established legal procedures. The path to Joan's canonization was much longer and more complex. The Catholic Church had to navigate the delicate question of how to recognize someone who had been condemned by an ecclesiastical court, even if that condemnation had been politically motivated. The process required extensive investigation of her life and miracles, as well as careful consideration of the theological implications of her claims to direct divine revelation. The canonization that finally occurred in 1920 reflected the Church's eventual recognition that Joan's mission had been genuinely inspired by God. Pope Benedict XV declared her a saint on May 16, 1920, nearly 500 years after her death. The long delay was partly due to the political sensitivities surrounding her memory, but it also reflected the Church's cautious approach to claims of divine inspiration that seemed to bypass established religious authority. But perhaps she never truly left the memory of France. Her image appears in churches and classrooms. Her name is whispered in both prayer and legend. And her story, brief and powerful, remains one of the clearest voices to rise out of the endless fog of war. The transformation of Joan of Arc from a historical figure into a national symbol occurred gradually over the centuries following her death. During the Renaissance, French writers began to celebrate her as an example of patriotic virtue, while Protestant reformers saw her as a victim of Catholic corruption. The Enlightenment brought a more skeptical view of her religious claims, but it also emphasized her role as a champion of the common people against aristocratic oppression. The French Revolution marked a crucial turning point in Joan's reputation. Revolutionary leaders, despite their hostility to the Catholic Church, embraced her as a symbol of popular resistance to foreign occupation. Napoleon Bonaparte claimed her as a predecessor, and her image appeared on revolutionary propaganda alongside other heroes of French resistance. The fact that she had been condemned by corrupt clergy only enhanced her appeal to anti-clerical revolutionaries. The 19th century saw Joan's elevation to the status of a national saint, a process that coincided with the development of modern French nationalism. Writers like Jules Michelet portrayed her as the embodiment of the French people's spirit, while politicians invoked her memory to justify various causes. The humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 intensified French identification with Joan as a symbol of resilience in the face of foreign occupation. The 20th century brought new interpretations of Joan's significance that reflected changing social and political concerns. Feminist writers celebrated her as an early example of female empowerment, while military historians analyzed her innovative tactical approaches. Psychologists and sociologists debated the nature of her religious experiences, while anthropologists examined her role in medieval popular culture. Throughout these reinterpretations, certain elements of Joan's story remained constant. She continued to represent the triumph of faith over cynicism, of courage over calculation, of individual conscience over institutional authority. Her willingness to sacrifice everything for her beliefs made her a powerful symbol for anyone facing overwhelming odds or corrupt opposition. Her youth and humble origins ensured that she remained accessible to ordinary people rather than remote like traditional aristocratic heroes. The churches and classrooms where Joan's image appears today serve as reminders of her enduring relevance. To believers, she represents the possibility of direct divine intervention in human affairs. To patriots, she embodies the spirit of national resistance. To idealists, she demonstrates that individuals can change the course of history through faith and determination. To the oppressed, she offers hope that justice will ultimately prevail over power. Now we move from her life to a battle she never saw. A battlefield where thousands fought, but many were never found. What happened at Agincourt still echoes in silence. The transition from Joan's story to the Battle of Agincourt represents a journey backward in time, from the moment when French fortunes began to turn toward the catastrophic defeat that had made her mission necessary. Agincourt was fought on October 25, 1415, 14 years before Joan lifted the siege of Orleans. In a muddy field in northern France that would become synonymous with military disaster and national humiliation. The battle that Joan never witnessed had shaped the world into which she was born. The English victory at Agincourt had shattered French confidence, eliminated an entire generation of military leaders, and established English dominance over much of France. The flower of French chivalry lay buried in the mud of that distant field, their deaths creating the vacuum of leadership that would persist, until a peasant girl from Domremy claimed to hear the voices of saints. The connection between Agincourt and Joan's mission was more than chronological. The defeat had broken something fundamental in the French psyche, a belief in the natural superiority of their knights and the righteousness of their cause. The English had achieved the impossible, defeating a French army that outnumbered them by at least 3-1. They had done so through superior tactics, better discipline, and what seemed like divine favor. The psychological impact of this victory would echo through the following decades, creating the atmosphere of despair and defeatism that Joan would eventually transform. Yet the very completeness of the disaster in Agincourt also contained the seeds of French recovery. The old military aristocracy, with its rigid traditions and outdated tactics, had been swept away in a single afternoon. The survivors were forced to think differently about warfare, about leadership, about the relationship between social status and military effectiveness. When Joan appeared with her banner and her voices, she found a France that was ready for something new, something that broke all the old rules, because the old rules had failed so catastrophically. The silence that followed Agincourt was not merely the quiet of death, but the hush of a world holding its breath, waiting for someone to speak the words that would break the spell of defeat. Joan's voice, when it finally came, carried across that silence like a bell tolling the end of one age and the beginning of another. The girl who had never seen Agincourt would prove that its lessons about French weakness and English invincibility were not eternal truths, but temporary conditions that faith and courage could overcome. The mud of Agincourt had swallowed the hopes of a generation, but it had also prepared the ground for a different kind of victory. In the darkness that followed that terrible day, when French nobles lay dead among the trampled wheat and English archers counted their impossible triumph, the future was already stirring. Somewhere in the distance, in a village that most of the dying knights had never heard of, a girl was being born who would carry the answer to their unfinished prayers. Picture the morning mist over a wide, open field. The grass is damp. The trees lining the edges are still bare, stripped by autumn wind. The sky above is pale and clouded. It is October 25th, 1415. A day that will become legend, though the men standing in the mud do not yet know it. The field is near a small French village called Agincourt. Today, it is mostly farmland, quiet, still, and undisturbed. But 6 centuries ago, it was the site of one of the most famous battles in medieval history. Thousands of English and French soldiers faced one another here. And when it was over, something was missing. Not just weapons or banners, but men. Entire units that vanished, leaving behind almost no trace. The morning had begun with nervous energy crackling through both armies. English soldiers, many of them common yeomen and farmers pressed into service, stood in loose formations. Their breath formed clouds in the cold air. They shifted their weight from foot to foot, checking their bowstrings one final time. The leather bracers on their arms were worn smooth from months of practice. Their quivers held perhaps 30 arrows each, long shafts of ash and oak, tipped with iron bodkins designed to pierce mail and plate. These were not the noble warriors of romance. They were practical men from the Welsh marsh, from Yorkshire dales, from the fens of Lincolnshire. They spoke in rough dialects that would have been barely comprehensible to the French nobility they faced. Their hands were calloused from years of drawing the massive war bows that required a lifetime of training to master. The draw weight of these weapons often exceeded 150 pounds, creating archers whose left shoulders sat permanently higher than their right, their spines curved by the constant pull of the bowstring. The English army was badly outnumbered. Estimates vary, but it may have been 1 to 5. Most of the English soldiers were archers, armed with longbows and short swords. They were hungry, sick, and exhausted from weeks of marching. Their armor was lighter, simpler, and they wore it for days without rest. Many had contracted dysentery during the siege of Harfleur. Others bore the gaunt look of men who had been eating half rations for weeks. Their leather jerkins were patched and stained. Their helmets, simple sallets and bastinets, showed the dents and scratches of previous engagements. King Henry V moved among his troops that morning, his own armor modest compared to the spectacle across the field. He was 28 years old, a young man who had already proven himself in the border wars with Wales. His face was lean, marked by a scar from an arrow wound received at the Battle of Shrewsbury. He spoke to his men in words they understood, reminding them of their homes, their families, their reasons for being so far from England's shores. The French army, in contrast, was well-fed, heavily armored, and confident. They expected an easy victory. Many of them were nobles or mounted knights, wearing polished plate and carrying banners stitched with the emblems of old families. Their armor gleamed even in the pale morning light. Each piece had been crafted by master armorers, fitted precisely to its wearer's body. The great helms and bastinets were works of art as much as protection, decorated with crests that proclaimed ancient lineages and territorial claims. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, commanded the French forces. Around him stood the flower of French nobility, the Duke of Alencon, the Duke of Brabant, the Count of Nevers. These men had been raised from childhood to fight. They had been taught to ride before they could properly walk, to handle sword and lance as extensions of their own bodies. Their destriers, the great war horses, were bred for power and aggression. Each animal was worth more than a common soldier might earn in a lifetime. The French formation was a sight to behold. 3 massive battles arranged in traditional style, with the mounted knights at the front, crossbowmen behind, and infantry in reserve. Oriflamme banners snapped in the wind, scarlet silk catching what little sun filtered through the clouds. The air rang with the sound of steel on steel as weapons were tested, the creak of leather, the snorting of horses eager for the charge. Yet there was something amiss in the French ranks. The narrow field constrained their movements. The recent rains had turned the plowed earth into a quagmire. The knights, accustomed to fighting on solid ground where their horses could maneuver freely, found themselves cramped between the woods of Tranquil and Agincourt. Their numerical advantage became a liability as they crowded together, unable to deploy their full strength effectively. The field itself was narrow and soft with rain. Plowed farmland lay between 2 patches of woods. It was not a good place for horses. The furrows ran perpendicular to the French line of advance, creating additional obstacles for the mounted charge. The soil, a heavy clay common to the region, had been churned by thousands of hooves and feet into a sticky morass that clung to everything it touched. But the French charged anyway, row after row of knights pushing forward in heavy columns. The mud slowed them down. What should have been a thunderous cavalry charge became a laborious advance. Horses stumbled in the deep ruts. Knights found their mounts sinking to their fetlocks in the churned earth. The perfect formations began to break apart as some riders pressed ahead while others fell behind, their horses struggling with the treacherous footing. The English archers had been waiting for this moment. They had driven sharpened stakes into the ground before their positions, creating a defensive hedge against cavalry. Now they drew their bows in unison, the collective sound like the creaking of a great ship's rigging. The first volley darkened the sky. Thousands of arrows arced high, then plunged down into the French ranks with a sound like hail on slate. Arrows filled the air. The bodkin points, designed specifically for this purpose, punched through mail links and found gaps in plate armor. Horses screamed and reared as the iron points found their mark. The destriers, bred for war, but not for this, began to panic. Some threw their riders. Others turned and fled back through their own ranks, spreading chaos. The French knights who reached the English lines found themselves facing a different kind of warfare than they had trained for. The English men-at-arms and archers fought with brutal efficiency, using weapons designed for close combat. War hammers, maces, roundel daggers that could slip between armor plates. They targeted the joints of armor, the gaps at elbow and knee, the vision slits of helmets. Then the English soldiers, lightly armored and mobile, ran forward with knives and mallets to finish the job. What followed was not the chivalrous combat of tournament grounds, but the grim business of killing. Wounded French knights, pinned by their own armor in the mud, were dispatched with mercy blows from misericord daggers. The English archers, their arrows spent, drew their falchions and mallets and joined the melee. The battle became a series of isolated struggles spread across the narrow field. French knights, separated from their companions, faced multiple opponents. The mud that had slowed their charge now trapped them. Armor that had been their protection became their prison. Men who had trained for mounted combat found themselves fighting on foot in conditions that favored their enemies. It was over by the afternoon. The English victory was so complete that it seemed almost miraculous. The French dead lay in heaps across the field. The living, those who had not fled, were taken prisoner. The ransom of noble captives would help finance the English war effort, but the cost in French lives was staggering. When the counting was done, the French had suffered devastating losses. Hundreds of nobles were captured or killed. Entire lines of cavalry were cut down. The English, against the odds, had won. It was a shocking outcome, one that echoed across Europe. The news traveled along the trade routes, carried by merchants and pilgrims. In Paris, the court received the reports with disbelief. In London, church bells rang in celebration. The immediate aftermath of the battle was chaos. The field was strewn with bodies, broken weapons, and the detritus of warfare. Wounded men cried out from the mud. Riderless horses wandered among the dead. The English soldiers, exhausted by their victory, began the grim work of collecting the wounded and counting the dead. But something about the aftermath has puzzled historians. Where are the bodies? The question haunts the study of Agincourt more than any tactical analysis or strategic assessment. For a battle that was so thoroughly documented, so completely recorded in chronicles and official accounts, the physical evidence is remarkably sparse. There are detailed records of who died. Names were listed, sometimes with family crests. The French nobility kept meticulous records of their losses. The Chronicle of Jean Lefebvre listed the dead by rank and family. The Gesta Henrici Quinti provided English accounts of the battle's toll. Chronicles described the scene in grim terms, speaking of heaps of armor, broken swords, and blood-stained banners. Yet when modern archaeologists began systematic surveys of the battlefield, they found almost nothing. No mass graves. No significant battlefield debris. Just fragments scattered lightly across the area. A few arrowheads, corroded beyond recognition. Pieces of metal that might have been armor or might have been farm implements. The occasional coin, its edges worn smooth by centuries of handling. In a battle where thousands perished, why is the land so quiet? The question has occupied historians and archaeologists for decades. Various theories have been proposed, each with its own merits and limitations. Some theories suggest that local villagers stripped the field after the battle. This explanation has considerable support. Metal was precious in medieval Europe. Iron and steel were valuable commodities that could be reworked into tools, weapons, or trade goods. Armor and weapons were worth small fortunes to common people. Even damaged pieces could be melted down and reused. The village of Agincourt itself was small and poor. The sudden appearance of tons of metal on their doorstep would have been an unprecedented windfall. Villagers would have worked through the night, collecting every scrap of useful material. Broken sword blades could be reforged into plowshares. Arrowheads contained enough iron to make nails or horseshoes. Even the leather from armor and horse tack had value. But the salvage operation would have been more complex than simple scavenging. The French nobility would have wanted to recover their dead, particularly the high-ranking casualties, whose bodies needed to be returned to their families for proper burial. The English would have been interested in identifying prisoners and assessing the value of captured equipment. The process of stripping a medieval battlefield was systematic and thorough. Professional scavengers, following in the wake of armies, had developed efficient methods for recovering useful materials. They worked in teams, each member responsible for specific types of salvage. Bodies were searched for valuables. Weapons were sorted by quality and condition. Armor was carefully removed and examined for damage. Even bones, in later centuries, were used to make fertilizer. The practice of grinding bones for agricultural use became common in the post-medieval period. Battlefield sites were sometimes deliberately excavated for this purpose, the remains of warriors becoming nutrients for crops. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. The bodies of men who had died for glory were transformed into sustenance for the humble vegetables that fed common people. Others think there may have been secret mass burials outside the field itself, perhaps in churchyards or along rural roads. This theory suggests that the dead were not left where they fell, but were moved to more appropriate burial sites. The French nobility, in particular, would have wanted proper interment for their kinsmen. The village church of Agincourt was small and would not have been able to accommodate the number of bodies generated by the battle. But there were other religious sites in the area. Monasteries and abbeys maintained cemeteries that might have served as burial grounds. The monks, bound by Christian duty to care for the dead, would have accepted the bodies regardless of nationality. Some burials might have been conducted in secret, particularly if they involved politically sensitive individuals. French nobles who had died in what was seen as a shameful defeat might have been buried quietly, without the usual ceremonies. English dead might have been interred hastily before the army continued its march. Those who survived may have carried away their comrades or buried them hastily in the woods. The English army, though victorious, was still deep in enemy territory. Henry V was eager to reach the safety of Calais before French reinforcements could arrive. The dead would have been buried quickly in shallow graves that left little trace. The woods of Tranquil and Agincourt, which had constrained the French charge, might have served as burial grounds. The dense forest would have provided cover for hasty interments. Tree roots and centuries of leaf fall would have disturbed and obscured grave sites. Modern forest management practices, including regular harvesting and replanting, would have further complicated archaeological investigation. There is also the simple truth that medieval battlefields were not preserved. No one imagined that one day people would want to study them. The concept of historical preservation was foreign to medieval thinking. Battlefields were simply places where armies had fought, no different from any other piece of land once the fighting was over. The land was plowed again, the rain washed over it, and time did its quiet work. Farmers returned to their fields within years, if not months, of the battle. The furrows that had hampered the French cavalry were smoothed and replanted. Crops grew in soil enriched by the decomposition of organic matter, including, quite possibly, human remains. Centuries of agricultural activity would have churned the soil repeatedly. Medieval plows, while not as deep as modern machinery, would have been sufficient to disturb shallow graves. The constant cycle of plowing, planting, and harvesting would have scattered any artifacts throughout the surrounding area. Weather, too, played its part in erasing the evidence. The clay soil of the region is prone to both waterlogging and cracking. Winter freezes and spring thaws would have shifted objects buried in the earth. Heavy rains would have washed smaller items into drainage ditches and streams. The natural processes of soil formation would have buried artifacts ever deeper. Yet Agincourt remains deeply present in the historical imagination, not because of what can be seen, but because of what cannot. The battle has become more than a historical event. It has become a cultural touchstone, a symbol of courage against odds, of the triumph of the common man over aristocratic privilege. The missing soldiers, the quiet field, the story told without a trace. These absences have become as significant as any physical evidence might have been. The gaps in the archaeological record have been filled by imagination, by the collective memory of a culture that needed heroes and found them in the archers of Agincourt. Shakespeare immortalized the battle in Henry V, though his account owed more to Elizabethan patriotism than to historical accuracy. His famous St. Crispin's Day speech, with its talk of "we few, we happy few, we band of brothers," has become more real to many people than the actual events of October 25th, 1415. The legend of Agincourt has grown in the telling. Each generation has found new meanings in the story. For the English, it became a symbol of national identity, proof that their small island nation could stand against the great powers of Europe. For the French, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of adapting to changing methods of warfare. Modern military historians have studied Agincourt for its tactical innovations. The effective use of the longbow, the integration of archers with men-at-arms, the selection of terrain that negated enemy advantages. These became standard elements of military doctrine. Staff colleges around the world have used Agincourt as a case study in the effective use of combined arms. But the absence of physical evidence adds a layer of mystery that enhances rather than diminishes the battle's hold on the imagination. The missing soldiers have become more powerful than any monument or museum display could ever be. They exist in the realm of possibility, in the space between what we know and what we can prove. Recent archaeological surveys have employed increasingly sophisticated techniques in the search for battlefield evidence. Ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and systematic excavation have all been used. Some small discoveries have been made: a scatter of arrowheads, fragments of medieval pottery, coins that might have been dropped during the battle. But the great prize, the mass graves, the weapon caches, the definitive proof of exactly what happened on that October day, remains elusive. The earth keeps its secrets. The field continues to offer up its modest harvest of wheat and barley, as it has for 6 centuries. Perhaps the silence is appropriate. War, for all its drama and heroism, is ultimately about death. The missing soldiers of Agincourt represent all the unnamed dead of medieval warfare, all the common men who died far from home in causes they might not have fully understood. Their absence is their monument. The field today is peaceful. Visitors come to see the site of the famous battle, but they find only farmland. A small museum in the village tells the story, but the land itself offers no obvious clues to its violent past. The silence is complete, profound, and somehow more moving than any display of medieval weaponry could be. And still, the silence holds weight. Perhaps it is a fitting end for a moment, shaped more by memory than remains. A field where so many fell, and so few were ever found. The missing soldiers of Agincourt have achieved a kind of immortality through their very absence. Their story told not in artifacts, but in the echoes of their names in chronicles and the persistent questions of historians. The mystery endures because it speaks to something fundamental about human memory and the way we construct meaning from the past. We need our heroes, our legends, our moments of triumph against impossible odds. The missing soldiers of Agincourt have become more than historical figures. They have become symbols of all the courage and sacrifice that goes unrecorded, all the heroism that leaves no trace. The very absence of evidence has spawned its own industry of speculation. Amateur historians and treasure hunters have combed the area with metal detectors, hoping to uncover the great hoard of medieval artifacts that must surely lie beneath the soil. Local farmers occasionally report finding unusual objects while plowing, but these discoveries are invariably disappointing. A corroded piece of iron that might be anything, a fragment of pottery that could date from any century. The French government has placed restrictions on metal detecting in the area, recognizing both the historical significance of the site and the potential damage that uncontrolled excavation might cause. Professional archaeologists work under strict guidelines, their efforts coordinated with local authorities and international scholars. Yet even these systematic investigations have yielded frustratingly little. The technology exists to find buried artifacts. Ground-penetrating radar can detect anomalies in soil composition. Magnetometers can locate ferrous metals buried deep underground. Chemical analysis can identify areas where large numbers of bodies might have decomposed. All these methods have been employed at Agincourt, and all have produced tantalizing hints, but no definitive answers. In 2019, a team of Belgian archaeologists claimed to have found evidence of the battle in the form of a small cluster of arrowheads and metal fragments. The discovery made international headlines, but subsequent analysis revealed that the artifacts were scattered over a wide area and could not be definitively linked to the 1415 battle. The mystery deepened rather than resolved. The search for Agincourt's missing soldiers has become a metaphor for the broader challenge of understanding medieval warfare. Written sources, no matter how detailed, can only tell us so much. The lived experience of combat, the reality of what happened when thousands of men clashed in deadly struggle, remains largely invisible to modern inquiry. Consider the logistics of the aftermath. The English army numbered perhaps 8,000 men, but they were exhausted, wounded, and eager to continue their march to Calais. They could not have lingered long on the battlefield. The French survivors, those who had not fled or been captured, were likely more concerned with escape than with burying their dead. The local population, caught between the two armies, would have prioritized their own survival over any systematic cleanup of the battlefield. The weather in late October 1415 was particularly harsh. Contemporary accounts describe continued rain and early frost. Bodies left exposed in such conditions would have decomposed rapidly. Scavengers, both animal and human, would have been active. Within weeks, the organic remains might have been scattered or consumed, leaving only scattered bones that could easily be overlooked or misidentified. The social structure of medieval society also influenced what happened to the dead. Common soldiers, the archers and foot soldiers, who made up the bulk of both armies, were not considered worthy of elaborate burial. Their bodies might have been disposed of in the most expedient manner possible. Mass graves would have been shallow and unmarked. Only the nobility would have received the careful attention that might have left lasting traces. Yet even the noble dead present puzzles. French chronicles record the deaths of specific individuals, men whose families would have paid significant sums for the recovery of their bodies. The Duke of Alençon, the Count of Fauquemberg, dozens of other titled men whose deaths are documented in precise detail. Where are their remains? How could such important figures simply vanish? The answer may lie in the speed with which medieval armies moved. Henry V was acutely aware that his victory at Agincourt, however complete, did not end his strategic vulnerability. French reinforcements were already being assembled. The English king needed to reach the safety of Calais before he could be trapped by a larger enemy force. The luxury of properly burying the dead was not available to him. French survivors faced their own constraints. The defeat at Agincourt was not just a military disaster, but a political catastrophe. The flower of French nobility had been cut down by common English archers. The humiliation was profound. Those who survived might have preferred to hide the evidence of their shame, rather than create monuments to their defeat. The village of Agincourt itself was transformed by the battle. Before October 25, 1415, it was an unremarkable farming community. After the battle, It became a place of pilgrimage and curiosity. Travelers would come to see the site where the impossible had happened. Local guides would point out supposed landmarks. The tree where Henry V had watched the battle, the spot where the French charge had faltered, the field where the bodies had been piled highest. But these stories, repeated and embellished over generations, may have obscured rather than preserved the truth. The human tendency to create narrative from chaos meant that the actual events of October 25th became overlaid with legend. The missing soldiers were absorbed into folklore, their absence explained by increasingly elaborate tales. Some stories claimed that the English had thrown the French dead into the river Tournoise, which flows near the battlefield. Others suggested that secret burial sites existed, their locations known only to local families who had sworn oaths of silence. These tales, passed down through generations, became part of the cultural landscape of the region. The Reformation and subsequent religious upheavals further complicated the preservation of burial records. Monasteries that might have maintained careful records of interments were dissolved. Church records were destroyed or scattered. The careful documentation that might have solved the mystery of Agincourt's missing soldiers was itself lost to time. Modern efforts to understand the battle have been hampered by the transformation of the landscape. The fields where the battle was fought have been altered by centuries of agricultural improvement. Drainage systems have been installed. Field boundaries have been redrawn. The very topography that influenced the course of the battle has been modified by human activity. The woods of Tranquil and Agincourt, which constrained the French cavalry, have been harvested and replanted multiple times. The original forest floor, where hasty burials might have taken place, has been disturbed by logging operations. Any artifacts buried in the wooded areas would have been scattered by the removal of tree stumps and the passage of heavy equipment. Climate change has also affected the site. The region has experienced both severe droughts and exceptional flooding in recent decades. These extreme weather events can expose buried artifacts, but also wash them away before they can be properly studied. The clay soil that trapped the French knights now presents its own challenges to archaeological investigation. The mystery of Agincourt's missing soldiers reflects broader questions about how we remember and commemorate historical events. The battle has become a symbol that transcends its historical reality. It represents the triumph of determination over privilege, of innovation over tradition, of the common man over the aristocrat. These symbolic meanings may be more important than the physical evidence of what actually happened. In this sense, the missing soldiers serve a purpose that physical remains could not. They embody the unknowable aspects of historical experience. They remind us that for all our sophisticated methods of investigation, much of the past remains forever beyond our reach. The silence of the field speaks more eloquently than any monument could. The cultural impact of Agincourt extends far beyond the battlefield itself. The battle influenced military thinking for centuries. The demonstration that disciplined infantry could defeat heavy cavalry led to fundamental changes in European warfare. The effectiveness of the longbow inspired military theorists to reconsider the role of missile weapons in battle. But perhaps more importantly, Agincourt became a touchstone for national identity. For the English, it proved that their small island nation could stand against the great powers of continental Europe. The image of the English archer, steady and determined in the face of overwhelming odds, became a defining element of national mythology. The French, too, found meaning in the defeat. Agincourt became a lesson in the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of adapting to changing circumstances. The disaster was analyzed and reanalyzed, becoming a case study in military failure that influenced French strategic thinking for generations. Literary treatments of the battle have shaped popular understanding as much as historical scholarship. Shakespeare's Henry V, with its stirring speeches and heroic characterizations, created a version of Agincourt that has become more real to many people than the historical event itself. The St. Crispin's Day speech, with its promise that We few, we happy few. We band of brothers would be remembered from this day to the ending of the world, has given the battle an emotional resonance that transcends historical accuracy. Modern military historians continue to study Agincourt for its tactical innovations and strategic lessons. The battle is taught in staff colleges as an example of how superior tactics and battlefield selection can overcome numerical disadvantage. The effective coordination of different types of troops, the use of terrain to negate enemy advantages, and the importance of maintaining discipline under pressure are all lessons that remain relevant to modern warfare. Yet the missing soldiers remind us that beneath all the strategic analysis and cultural interpretation lies a fundamental human reality. Thousands of men died in the mud of a French field 6 centuries ago. They were sons and fathers, brothers and friends. They had hopes and fears, dreams and ambitions. They went to war for reasons that may have seemed compelling at the time, but now appear tragically futile. The absence of their remains does not diminish their sacrifice. If anything, it makes their story more poignant. They died far from home, in a foreign land, fighting for causes that outlived them. Their bodies became part of the soil they fought over, their bones scattered and lost, their names forgotten, except in the careful records of medieval chroniclers. In the end, perhaps the silence of the field is the most appropriate memorial. It speaks to the mystery of human experience, the way that profound events can leave barely a trace in the physical world. The missing soldiers of Agincourt have achieved a kind of immortality through their very absence. Their story told not in stone monuments, but in the persistent questions of those who seek to understand the past. The battlefield today continues to yield its modest harvest. Farmers plow the same fields where knights once charged and archers drew their bows. The earth turns as it has for centuries, keeping its secrets, maintaining its silence. Visitors come seeking traces of the famous battle, but they find only the enduring mystery of what happened to those who fell. And perhaps that is enough. The missing soldiers of Agincourt have become more than historical figures. They have become symbols of all the unknown warriors who have died in forgotten places, all the courage that goes unrecorded, all the sacrifice that leaves no trace. Their absence speaks louder than any monument could, their silence more eloquent than any inscription. The very soil beneath our feet at Agincourt has become a palimpsest, layers of history, written and overwritten by time itself. Each spring plowing turns the earth anew, mixing medieval clay with modern fertilizer, ancient bone meal with contemporary seeds. The farmers who work these fields may unknowingly scatter the remains of warriors with each pass of their machinery. The irony is profound. The men who died for glory now nourish the humble vegetables that feed ordinary families. Local folklore has preserved fragments of memory that official history has forgotten. Village elders still speak of certain fields where nothing grows quite right, where the soil seems somehow different. Children are told not to play in particular corners of the woods, though no one can quite remember why. These oral traditions, dismissed by academic historians as mere superstition, may preserve echoes of truth that written records have lost. The nearby church of St. Pierre at Agincourt contains stone effigies worn smooth by centuries of weather and touch. Visitors assume these represent local nobility, but church records are incomplete. Some of these nameless figures might commemorate men who died in the battle, their identities lost when the parish registers were destroyed during the wars of religion. The stones themselves have become repositories of collective memory, their blank faces holding secrets that will never be revealed. Archaeological surveys have revealed the presence of medieval pottery shards throughout the area. But these fragments tell a different story than the one historians expected. Rather than evidence of hasty battlefield burials, they suggest the existence of temporary camps and supply depots. The English army, despite its reputation for rapid movement, had established a more complex logistical network than previously understood. Cook fires, latrines, and equipment caches left their marks on the landscape. The absence of battlefield debris has forced scholars to reconsider their assumptions about medieval warfare itself. Perhaps the traditional image of knights charging across open fields, leaving behind scattered weapons and armor, is fundamentally flawed. The reality may have been more organized, more systematic than romantic accounts suggest. Armies of the period were becoming increasingly professional, with established procedures for salvaging equipment and caring for casualties. French military engineers in the 18th century conducted detailed surveys of the Agincourt area as part of their study of historical battlefields. Their maps and reports, housed in the archives of the Service Historique de la Défense, reveal a landscape significantly different from the one that exists today. Marshlands that have since been drained, hill slopes that have been leveled, and stream courses that have been diverted all point to environmental changes that could explain the absence of battlefield remains. The search for Agincourt's missing soldiers has inadvertently uncovered evidence of other forgotten conflicts. Roman coins, medieval pilgrim badges, and artifacts from the Franco-Prussian War have all been discovered in the area. The field has witnessed centuries of human activity, each layer of occupation potentially disturbing or obscuring the traces of previous events. The famous Battle of 1415 was just one moment in a long history of human presence. Weather patterns in the region have changed dramatically since the medieval period. The Little Ice Age, which began in the 14th century, brought harsher winters and wetter summers than the area experiences today. These climatic shifts affected soil composition and drainage patterns. Ground that was marshy in 1415 might be well drained today, while areas that were once solid might now be prone to flooding. The very conditions that influenced the battle's outcome have been erased by climate change. The question of the missing soldiers has spawned its own academic subdiscipline: conflict archaeology, the systematic study of battlefield sites, has developed specialized techniques for locating and interpreting evidence of warfare. Researchers have learned to read the landscape itself as a historical document, interpreting subtle variations in soil color, plant growth, and magnetic signatures as clues to past events. Yet Agincourt continues to resist these modern methods. The battlefield seems to have been sanitized with unusual thoroughness. Even sites of much smaller engagements typically yield more artifacts than have been found at Agincourt. The absence of evidence has become evidence itself, suggesting that the aftermath of the battle was managed with a degree of organization that contradicts the image of medieval warfare as chaotic and uncontrolled. The economic impact of the battle on the local community has been largely overlooked by historians focused on military tactics and political consequences. The sudden influx of thousands of soldiers would have strained local resources. Food supplies, building materials, and craft services would have been in high demand. The aftermath would have brought both opportunities and challenges. Valuable salvage to be recovered, but also damaged crops, contaminated water sources, and potential disease outbreaks. Local church records, where they survive, hint at unusual burial practices in the years following the battle. References to the field of the dead and the place of many bones appear in land grants and property transfers. These euphemistic descriptions suggest that the location of mass graves was common knowledge among the local population, even if the specific details were not officially recorded. The development of historical tourism in the 19th century brought new pressures to the Agincourt site. Victorian visitors expected to find tangible evidence of the famous battle. Local entrepreneurs obliged by manufacturing authentic artifacts, arrowheads, pieces of armor, and other relics that satisfied tourist expectations. These fabricated items, scattered across the landscape by decades of commercial activity, have complicated modern archaeological efforts. The linguistic landscape of the region preserves memories that official history has forgotten. Field names like Champ des Morts and Terra Sanglante appear in medieval land surveys. Street names in nearby villages reference the battle, but not always in ways that align with accepted historical narratives. These toponymic traces suggest that local knowledge of the battle's aftermath was more complex and detailed than surviving written records indicate. The mystery of Agincourt's missing soldiers has become intertwined with broader questions about historical memory and collective trauma. How do communities process and preserve the memory of catastrophic events? What happens when the physical evidence of tragedy disappears, leaving only stories and legends? The empty field at Agincourt serves as a meditation on these universal human experiences. Modern conflicts have provided new perspectives on the Agincourt mystery. The systematic destruction of evidence during 20th century wars, the deliberate erasure of battlefield sites, and the political manipulation of historical memory have all created parallels to the medieval situation. Perhaps the missing soldiers of Agincourt were not lost to time and neglect, but removed as part of a conscious effort to control historical narrative. The battlefield's silence has become its most powerful voice. In an age of constant documentation and digital preservation, the absence of evidence seems almost impossible to imagine. Yet Agincourt reminds us that most of human history has vanished without a trace. The missing soldiers represent not just the dead of one battle, but the countless unnamed individuals whose lives and deaths had been forgotten by time. Let us leave the battlefield now and walk into another world entirely. Not mud and arrows, but silk and pageantry. Away from the democracy of death that claimed noble and common alike in the churned earth of Agincourt, we ascend to those rarefied heights where survival was measured not in the draw of a bow or the thrust of a blade, but in the delicate art of influence and the dangerous game of proximity to power. We turn next to the upper floors of stone keeps and gilded halls, where noblemen whispered secrets that could topple kingdoms, where queens moved their pieces across boards, both literal and metaphorical, and where falcons rested quietly on velvet-wrapped wrists, their fierce eyes reflecting the calculating gaze of their masters. Here, in these perfumed chambers high above the common world, different battles were fought with different weapons, and the casualties, though bloodless, were no less final than those left buried in the mud of France. Step away now from the smoke of ruined villages and the silence of battlefields. We are entering a different world, though it existed at the very same time. This world is warmer, cleaner, and dressed in velvet. The floors are swept. The food is spiced. The air smells of beeswax and rosewater. This is the court of medieval France. Picture an early morning in a castle along the Loire River. The stone walls are thick, but tapestries help keep the chambers warmer. Sunlight glows softly through the glass of a narrow window. A servant arrives with a basin of warm water and lays out a fresh linen robe trimmed with embroidery. The morning ritual begins with a gentle splash of water against skin, the careful arrangement of clothing, the quiet murmur of daily preparations that have remained unchanged for generations. The castle itself awakens slowly, like a great stone creature stirring from slumber. In the kitchens below, cooks have been working since before dawn, their hands busy kneading bread dough and tending to fires that have burned continuously through the night. The scent of baking bread mingles with the sharper notes of herbs being chopped for the morning meal. Kitchen maids carry pewter jugs of fresh milk from the dairy, their wooden shoes clicking against the stone floors in a rhythm that has become the heartbeat of the household. Here, the rhythm of the day follows a different pace. Nobles rise slowly, dress with assistance, and begin the day not with labor, but with ceremony. Morning prayers are followed by a light meal, often bread with fruit or wine mixed with water. Scribes and messengers wait quietly, ready to deliver letters or petitions. Pages and squires stand nearby, always within reach, yet never speaking unless spoken to. The chapel bells ring the hour, their bronze voices echoing through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors, whose painted eyes seem to follow the living as they pass. The sound travels through chambers where courtiers are already stirring, their personal servants lighting candles and opening shutters to let in the pale morning light. In the Lord's chamber, a valet carefully selects the day's attire based on the scheduled activities and the subtle messages that each choice of color and fabric might convey. Conversation is an art. A misplaced word can carry political consequences. A pause can say more than a full sentence. Court life is a kind of performance where every gesture is deliberate and every decision, no matter how small, is shaped by status and strategy. The ability to speak well is prized above almost all other skills. And those who master the delicate balance of wit and diplomacy find themselves rising through the complex hierarchy of court favor. Young nobles spend years learning the intricate dance of court discourse. They study not only what to say, but how to say it, when to remain silent, and how to interpret the subtle signals that others send through tone, posture, and the careful choice of words. A raised eyebrow at the wrong moment can signal disapproval that might take months to overcome. A well-timed compliment can secure an alliance that will last for years. The Queen's chambers are filled with quieter activity. Ladies gather around embroidery frames, weaving silk threads into tapestries that will take years to complete. Children learn Latin verses or the rules of heraldry. A falcon rests calmly by the window, its head hooded, its feathers sleek. The atmosphere here is one of refined concentration, where the creation of beauty is seen as both an art and a duty. The ladies of the court possess an education that would surprise many modern observers. They read Latin and often speak several languages. They understand the complex rules of precedence that govern every social interaction. They know which saints to invoke for different ailments, which herbs will ease a headache, and how to manage the vast household staffs that keep the castle running smoothly. Their needlework is not mere decoration, but a form of storytelling with each tapestry. An embroidered panel recording the deeds of heroes, the genealogies of noble families, or scenes from religious texts. Children at court grow up in a world of constant instruction. They learn to read not only French but Latin, the language of the church and of international diplomacy. They memorize the complex rules of heraldry that will allow them to identify friend from foe on a battlefield or in a diplomatic gathering. They study music, not as entertainment, but as a necessary social skill, and they learn to play the lute, the harp, or the psaltery with the same dedication that their peasant contemporaries apply to learning the rhythms of planting and harvest. Meals at court are elaborate. They are not rushed. A midday feast might stretch across several hours. Trays of roasted meat are carried in, along with fine white bread, imported spices, and sweet wines from southern vineyards. Music plays softly in the background. A lute, a harp, perhaps a gentle voice singing in Old French. The great hall fills with the sounds of conversation, the clink of pewter against pottery, and the soft footsteps of servants moving between the long tables. The food itself is less familiar than it might seem. Forks are not widely used. Most people eat with fingers and knives. Dishes are often sweet and savory at once, flavored with cinnamon, ginger, or saffron. The wealthier the court, the more intricate the meal. Peacocks are served with feathers reattached. Fish pies are shaped like sea creatures. It is not just nourishment. It is spectacle. Each course arrives with its own ceremony. Servants carry silver platters piled high with meat that has been carved into elaborate shapes or decorated with precious spices that have traveled thousands of miles from distant lands. The bread is white as snow, a mark of distinction in an age when most people eat the darker, coarser grain of barley or rye. Wine flows freely, not only from the vineyards of France, but from distant regions where the grapes grow on hillsides that most of the diners will never see. The spices themselves tell stories of adventure and commerce. Saffron, worth more than its weight in gold, arrives from fields in Spain, where it is harvested by hand from the delicate stigmas of crocus flowers. Cinnamon comes from the bark of trees that grow in Ceylon, carried by merchants who have risked their lives crossing deserts and sailing dangerous seas. Ginger travels from the markets of Asia, its heat and complexity adding fire to dishes that might otherwise taste bland to palates accustomed to strong flavors. The presentation of food becomes an art form in itself. Master cooks compete to create dishes that will astonish their diners with their ingenuity and beauty. They construct elaborate pies that conceal whole birds within other birds, creating a puzzle of flavors and textures that unfolds with each bite. They sculpt sugar into miniature castles and shape marzipan into figures that tell stories from classical mythology or Christian legend. Afternoons may include a hunt. Nobles ride out on horseback, dressed in fitted leather and velvet, accompanied by dogs and falconers. The hunt is not only sport, but training. It builds discipline and coordination. It also provides moments for whispered alliances, private counsel, and observation. The forest becomes a temporary court where the usual rules of precedence are relaxed, just enough to allow for conversations that would be impossible within the formal confines of the castle. The horses themselves are works of art, bred for generations to combine speed with grace, power with responsiveness. They wear bridles decorated with silver and saddles covered in the finest leather, their manes braided with ribbons that match their riders' colors. The hounds are equally prized, their bloodlines as carefully maintained as those of their noble masters, their training as rigorous as that of any knight preparing for battle. Falconry represents the pinnacle of hunting arts. The birds are magnificent creatures, their eyes sharp and intelligent, their movements precise and deadly. The relationship between falconer and falcon is one of mutual respect and careful training, built over months of patient work. To watch a falcon hunt is to witness a partnership between human and animal that speaks to humanity's ancient connection with the natural world. The forest itself provides a different kind of education. Here, young nobles learn to read the subtle signs that indicate the presence of game, to understand the complex relationships between predator and prey, weather and season. They develop the patience to wait motionless for hours, the skill to move silently through dense undergrowth, and the judgment to know when to strike and when to hold back. Evenings return to music and games. Chess is favored among the educated. The court watches in near silence as two players sit across from one another, staring at a checkered board of carved ivory or stone. Each move carries symbolic weight, mimicking the strategy of war or politics. The game itself is relatively new to Western Europe, having arrived through contact with the Islamic world, but it has quickly become popular among those who appreciate its combination of intellectual challenge and symbolic richness. The chess pieces themselves are often works of art, carved from ivory or precious woods, their faces detailed enough to represent specific historical figures or mythological characters. The board might be inlaid with silver or decorated with precious stones, transforming a simple game into a treasure worthy of a king's collection. The rules are still evolving, with different regions playing variations that reflect local customs and preferences. Poetry is also part of court life. Troubadours sing ballads about distant love or noble sacrifice. Some of the verses are improvised on the spot. Others have been passed down for generations. Language at court is refined and musical, full of metaphors and double meanings. The troubadour tradition represents one of the great flowering of medieval culture, creating a body of literature that explores the complex emotions and ideals of courtly society. The concept of courtly love, central to much troubadour poetry, establishes a new model for relationships between men and women. This idealized form of love emphasizes devotion, restraint, and the spiritual elevation that comes from loving someone who is noble and worthy, but ultimately unattainable. The lady becomes a figure of inspiration, her beauty and virtue motivating the lover to great deeds and noble behavior. Music at court encompasses far more than entertainment. It serves as a form of communication, a way of expressing emotions and ideas that might be too dangerous or too personal to speak aloud. A skilled musician can convey political allegiances, romantic interests, or social commentary through the careful choice of songs, and the subtle emphasis given to particular verses. The audience, equally skilled in reading these musical messages, responds with their own signals of approval or disapproval. The instruments themselves are crafted with the same attention to beauty and precision that characterizes all aspects of court life. Lutes are made from woods that have been aged for decades, their strings carefully tuned to produce tones that are both clear and warm. Harps are carved from single pieces of wood and decorated with intricate patterns that tell stories of their own. The human voice, trained from childhood to produce the clear, pure tones that are prized in medieval music, becomes an instrument capable of extraordinary expression. But court life is not without its shadows. Behind the silks and ceremonies lie constant tension. Every marriage is arranged to secure a treaty or a dowry. Every smile may hide a rivalry. Favor from the king or queen can vanish without warning. And for women especially, options are limited. Marriage, a convent, or disgrace. The beauty and refinement of court life cannot completely mask the underlying realities of power and survival that govern every aspect of medieval society. The marriage negotiations that shape the lives of noble families are conducted with the same careful attention to detail that characterizes military campaigns. Ambassadors travel between courts, carrying proposals and counter-proposals that will determine not only the personal happiness of the individuals involved, but the political future of entire regions. A successful marriage alliance can bring peace between warring factions, secure trade routes, or provide the military support needed to defend against foreign invasion. Young women at court understand from an early age that their beauty, intelligence, and accomplishments are assets to be carefully cultivated and strategically deployed. They learn to read the subtle signs that indicate a potential suitor's interest, to understand the complex calculations that their families make when evaluating marriage proposals, and to accept that their personal preferences will always be secondary to political necessity. The fate of those who fall from favor serves as a constant reminder of the precarious nature of court life. A trusted advisor can find himself stripped of lands and titles overnight. A lady who has enjoyed years of royal favor can suddenly discover that her presence is no longer welcome at court. The reasons for these falls from grace are often mysterious, the result of whispered accusations, shifting alliances, or simply the capricious nature of royal favor. Still, many found comfort in routine. In the warmth of familiar stone, the soft footsteps on polished floors, the low murmur of voices over chessboards and candlelight. For them, court life was a world apart, far from the mud and hardship of the peasantry. Yet even here, war was never far. Letters arrived from the front. Allies shifted. Fortunes changed. The castle walls that provide protection from the dangers of the outside world also serve as a constant reminder that those dangers exist. The daily routines of court life create a sense of stability and continuity that helps to offset the underlying uncertainties of medieval existence. The same servants appear at the same times each day, carrying out tasks that have been performed in the same way for generations. The same prayers are said at the same hours, their familiar words providing comfort and structure. The same foods appear on the table in the same order, their preparation following recipes that have been passed down through generations of cooks. The physical spaces of the castle become deeply familiar to those who inhabit them. Every stone, every tapestry, every piece of furniture carries associations and memories. The great hall where feasts are held also serves as a court of law, where disputes are settled and justice is administered. The chapel where daily prayers are said also hosts the ceremonies that mark the great transitions of life: births, marriages, deaths. The private chambers where families gather also serve as offices where the business of governing is conducted. The relationship between the court and the wider world beyond the castle walls is complex and constantly evolving. Messengers arrive regularly with news from other courts, reports from distant lands, and updates on the progress of military campaigns. Merchants come to sell their goods. bringing with them stories of their travels and observations about conditions in other parts of the country. Pilgrims stop to rest and share news from the holy sites they have visited. The court's influence extends far beyond its physical boundaries. The fashions adopted by courtiers are copied by the emerging merchant classes in distant cities. The literary forms developed by court poets spread throughout Europe, inspiring new works in different languages and different cultural contexts. The political alliances forged in castle halls shaped the destinies of entire nations. And so the court continued, quiet, measured, and enclosed, a place of luxury, but also of limits, of beauty, carefully arranged, of power, carefully preserved. The rhythm of court life provided a kind of stability in an age of constant change and uncertainty. Within the protected walls of the castle, it was possible to create a world where beauty and refinement could flourish, where intellectual and artistic pursuits could be cultivated, and where the harsh realities of medieval life could be temporarily forgotten. But even as the courtiers played their games of chess and listened to their troubadours sing of noble love, the world outside continued to turn. In the workshops of the growing cities, craftsmen were developing new techniques and technologies that would eventually transform the nature of warfare and commerce. In the universities that were beginning to appear across Europe, scholars were rediscovering the works of ancient philosophers and developing new ways of understanding the natural world. In the fields and forests, common people were slowly developing new forms of social organization that would eventually challenge the assumptions on which the feudal system was built. The court represented the pinnacle of medieval civilization, the place where the ideals and aspirations of the age were most fully realized. But it was also a world that was already beginning to show signs of the changes that would eventually transform European society. The very luxury and refinement that characterized court life were made possible by new forms of economic organization, new technologies, and new ways of thinking about the relationship between social classes. The seasonal rhythms of court life provide their own kind of drama and anticipation. Winter brings the court indoors, where the great fireplaces burn continuously, and the chambers grow thick with the smoke of wood and the warmth of bodies pressed together for entertainment. The long, dark months become a time of intensive storytelling, when the oral traditions of the region are passed down through elaborate recitations that can last for hours. Professional storytellers, often blind men whose memories have been sharpened by their inability to rely on written texts, recite the great epic poems of the age, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of ancient verses. These winter evenings also provide opportunities for the more private forms of entertainment that define court culture. Card games, newly arrived from the Islamic world through trade routes that connect France to distant lands, become popular among the younger nobles. The cards themselves are hand-painted works of art, their designs reflecting the complex symbolism of medieval thought. Playing cards is not merely gambling, but a form of social interaction that allows for the subtle communication of ideas and emotions that might be too dangerous to express directly. The long winter nights also provide time for the copying and illumination of manuscripts, an art form that reaches extraordinary heights of sophistication in the courts of medieval France. Scribes work by candlelight, their reed pens moving carefully across sheets of parchment that have been prepared from the skins of sheep or calves. The text they copy might be a religious work, a collection of poetry, or a treatise on philosophy, but regardless of its content, each manuscript becomes a unique work of art. The illuminators who decorate these manuscripts are among the most skilled artists of their time. They work with pigments made from crushed minerals, plant extracts, and even powdered gold, creating images that glow with an inner light. The margins of the pages bloom with intricate designs of vines and flowers, fantastic creatures, and tiny scenes that comment on or complement the main text. These marginal decorations often contain hidden meanings, jokes, or references that would be understood only by the educated elite who would have access to such books. Spring brings a transformation to court life that affects every aspect of daily routine. The castle shutters are thrown open to let in the sweet air that carries the scent of apple blossoms and new grass. The courtyards that have been empty all winter suddenly fill with activity as servants hang tapestries and clothing to air in the sunshine. The sound of laughter and conversation moves outdoors, where it mingles with the songs of birds and the gentle murmur of water flowing in the streams that have been freed from winter ice. The arrival of spring also means the return of traveling entertainers who have spent the winter months in warmer southern courts. Jongleurs arrive with their acrobatic skills and their ability to juggle multiple objects while reciting poetry. Minstrels come with new songs learned in distant lands, their lyrics often carrying news of political developments or social changes that have occurred in other parts of Europe. Puppet shows provide entertainment for children and adults alike, their simple stories often containing sophisticated commentary on contemporary events. Spring also brings the renewal of building projects that have been suspended during the winter months. The castle itself is a work in progress, with new towers being added, existing chambers being enlarged, and decorative elements being refined. The craftsmen who work on these projects are among the most skilled in medieval Europe. Their techniques passed down through generations of master builders who have learned to work with stone as if it were clay. The gardens that surround the castle begin to show signs of the sophisticated horticultural knowledge that characterizes medieval court culture. These are not the wild gardens of peasant cottages, but carefully planned spaces that reflect both aesthetic principles and practical needs. Herb gardens provide the medicines that are essential to medieval healthcare. They're plants carefully cultivated to produce the maximum concentration of healing compounds. Rose gardens provide both beauty and raw materials for the perfumes and cosmetics that are essential to court life. The vegetable gardens that supply the castle kitchens are marvels of medieval agricultural science. The gardeners who tend them understand the complex relationships between different plants, knowing which combinations will produce the highest yields and which will help to control pests and diseases. They practice crop rotation, composting, and irrigation techniques that are far more sophisticated than the simple farming methods used by the peasantry. Summer brings the height of court activity, when the favorable weather allows for extended hunting expeditions, elaborate outdoor festivals, and the visits of foreign dignitaries that are essential to medieval diplomacy. The castle courtyards become stages for elaborate theatrical performances that combine music, dance, and storytelling in ways that would influence the development of European drama for centuries to come. The summer months also provide opportunities for the kind of extended travel that is impossible during the winter. The court itself might move from castle to castle, a massive undertaking that requires the coordination of hundreds of people and the transport of tons of supplies. These progresses serve both practical and symbolic purposes, allowing the nobility to inspect their lands personally, while also demonstrating their wealth and power to their subjects. The arrival of summer also means the return of the great fairs that are essential to medieval commerce. These gatherings bring together merchants from across Europe and beyond, creating temporary cities where exotic goods can be purchased and new fashions can be discovered. The court sends representatives to these fairs, not only to purchase luxury items, but also to gather intelligence about political and economic developments in other regions. Autumn brings its own rhythms to court life, as the harvest season requires the attention of even the highest nobility. The success or failure of the crops will determine not only the prosperity of the peasantry, but also the tax revenues that support the elaborate lifestyle of the court. Nobles who have spent the summer in leisure suddenly find themselves involved in the complex negotiations that determine how the harvest will be divided between the needs of the peasants and the demands of their overlords. The autumn months also provide opportunities for the great ceremonial hunts that serve both practical and symbolic purposes. These massive undertakings, involving hundreds of participants and lasting for days or even weeks, provide meat for the winter months while also serving as displays of noble power and cooperation. The organization of such hunts requires diplomatic skills that are as sophisticated as those needed for military campaigns or marriage negotiations. The religious calendar that governs medieval life creates its own rhythm of festivals and observances that punctuate the year with moments of particular significance. The great feasts of the Christian year become occasions for elaborate ceremonies that combine religious devotion with political display. Christmas brings the exchange of gifts that strengthen social bonds and political alliances. Easter celebrates renewal and rebirth with pageants that involve the entire court community. The feast days of particular saints provide opportunities for the expression of regional identities and family loyalties. The role of music in these religious observances cannot be overstated. The court chapel maintains a choir of skilled singers whose voices have been trained from childhood to produce the pure, ethereal tones that are considered appropriate for worship. The polyphonic music that develops in these court chapels represents one of the great achievements of medieval culture, creating complex harmonies that seem to lift the human spirit toward divine contemplation. The manuscripts that preserve this music are themselves works of art, their pages decorated with elaborate initials and marginal designs that reflect the beauty of the music they contain. The notation systems that develop to record these complex compositions represent a technological breakthrough that makes possible the preservation and transmission of musical ideas across time and space. The intellectual life of the court extends far beyond the entertainment provided by troubadours and storytellers. The libraries that are maintained in the great castles contain works of theology, philosophy, history, and natural science that represent the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The scholars who study these works are often clerics, who have received their education in the cathedral schools that are beginning to evolve into the first universities. The debates that take place in these court circles help to shape the intellectual development of medieval Europe. Questions about the nature of political authority, the relationship between faith and reason, and the proper organization of society are discussed with a sophistication that would surprise those who think of the medieval period as an age of intellectual darkness. The ideas that emerge from these discussions will eventually influence the development of European philosophy, law, and political theory for centuries to come. The role of women in court intellectual life is more complex and significant than is often recognized. While formal education is generally reserved for men, noble women often receive an informal education that is remarkably comprehensive. They learn to read and write in multiple languages, to understand the complex legal and financial arrangements that govern their family's affairs, and to participate in the intellectual discussions that shape court culture. Some women achieve remarkable influence through their intellectual accomplishments. They serve as patrons of scholars and artists, commission works of literature and art, and participate in the political discussions that determine the fate of their regions. The letters that survive from some of these women reveal minds that are as sharp and well-informed as those of their male contemporaries. The medical knowledge that is available at medieval courts represents a sophisticated synthesis of classical learning, Islamic science, and practical experience. Court physicians are often among the most learned individuals of their time, their knowledge encompassing not only the treatment of disease, but also the prevention of illness through proper diet, exercise, and lifestyle. The medical texts that they study include works by ancient Greek and Roman authors, translated Arabic treatises on surgery and pharmacology, and contemporary observations about the relationship between health and environment. The pharmaceutical knowledge available to court physicians is remarkably extensive. They understand the properties of hundreds of different plants and minerals, knowing how to prepare them in ways that maximize their therapeutic effects while minimizing their dangers. The court gardens often include extensive collections of medicinal plants, carefully cultivated to ensure a reliable supply of the raw materials needed for medical treatment. The surgical techniques practiced by court physicians are far more sophisticated than is often realized. They perform operations on cataracts, set broken bones, and treat wounds with methods that will not be significantly improved upon for centuries. The instruments they use are precision tools, often made by the same craftsmen who create the weapons and armor used by knights. The understanding of hygiene and sanitation that characterizes court life is also more advanced than is commonly supposed. The great castles have elaborate systems for the disposal of waste, the provision of clean water, and the maintenance of personal cleanliness. The public baths that are maintained in many castles are not merely places for washing, but social centers where business is conducted and relationships are maintained. The clothing worn at court represents one of the most visible expressions of the wealth and sophistication of medieval noble culture. The fabrics themselves are marvels of medieval textile technology, woven from silk threads that have traveled thousands of miles from China, dyed with colors extracted from plants and minerals found in remote corners of the world, and embellished with gold and silver threads that transform simple garments into works of art. The process of creating these garments involves skilled craftsmen whose techniques have been refined over generations. The tailors who cut and sew the clothing understand the complex relationship between fabric and form, creating garments that not only fit perfectly, but also communicate precise information about the wearer's social status, political affiliations, and personal taste. The embroiderers who decorate these garments are artists in their own right, their needlework telling stories and conveying messages that are as sophisticated as any other form of medieval art. The jewelry worn at court serves both decorative and practical purposes. Rings, brooches, and other ornaments are not merely displays of wealth, but also symbols of political alliance, family heritage, and personal identity. The techniques used to create these pieces involve sophisticated knowledge of metallurgy, gem cutting, and design that rival the best work of any period in human history. The evolution of court etiquette represents one of the most significant cultural developments of the medieval period. The elaborate rules that govern behavior at court are not arbitrary restrictions, but carefully developed systems that allow large numbers of people to live together in relative harmony, while maintaining the hierarchical relationships that are essential to medieval society. The mastery of these rules becomes a form of education in itself, teaching young nobles the self-discipline and social awareness that they will need to function effectively in the complex world of medieval politics. The architectural spaces of the medieval court reflect and reinforce the social hierarchies that define noble life. The Great Hall, with its soaring timber roof and massive stone walls, serves as the symbolic heart of the castle community. The placement of every piece of furniture, every tapestry, every candle holder has been carefully calculated to communicate messages about power, status, and relationship. The high table, raised on a platform at one end of the hall, provides a stage where the lord and his most important guests can be seen and admired by all present. The arrangement of the lower tables follows strict protocols that reflect the complex web of obligations and allegiances that bind the court community together. The private chambers that surround the Great Hall are equally symbolic spaces. The Lord Solar, his private retreat from the public demands of leadership, is furnished with the finest objects that his wealth can command. The walls are covered with tapestries that tell the stories of his family's heroic past, their colors still bright despite the years that have passed since they were woven. The furniture is made from woods that have been imported from distant forests, carved by craftsmen whose skills have been honed through decades of practice. The chapel that adjoins the Lord's private quarters serves both spiritual and political functions. The religious services that are held there daily provide opportunities for the expression of devotion that is expected of Christian nobles, but they also serve as occasions for the display of wealth and the reinforcement of social relationships. The altar is decorated with objects of gold and silver, their surfaces studded with gems that catch and reflect the light of hundreds of candles. The stained glass windows that filter the sunlight into jeweled patterns across the stone floor are not merely decorative but didactic, their images telling stories from Scripture that reinforce the moral and political lessons that the court community is expected to learn. The castle's defenses, while primarily military in function, also serve as symbols of the power and permanence of noble authority. The massive gatehouse, with its twin towers and iron portcullis, communicates a message of strength and security that extends far beyond its practical function. The walls that surround the castle are not merely barriers against attack, but statements of the Lord's ability to protect his people and maintain order in his domain. The very stones from which these walls are built have been selected not only for their strength, but also for their appearance, creating structures that are both formidable and beautiful. The water systems that supply the castle represent some of the most sophisticated engineering achievements of the medieval period. The wells that provide fresh water have been dug with careful attention to the underground streams and springs that feed them. The cisterns that store rainwater are lined with materials that prevent contamination and maintain the purity of the water supply. The drainage systems that carry away wastewater are designed with an understanding of hydraulic principles that will not be significantly improved upon for centuries. The heating systems that make the castle livable during the winter months represent another area of medieval technological sophistication. The great fireplaces that dominate the main chambers are designed not only to provide warmth, but also to create currents of air that will carry smoke away from the living spaces. The hypocaust systems that some castles inherit from Roman times are maintained and adapted to medieval needs, creating forms of central heating that are remarkably efficient and comfortable. The lighting systems that illuminate the castle after dark involve both practical and aesthetic considerations. The candles that provide most of the light are made from materials that have been carefully chosen for their ability to burn cleanly and brightly. Beeswax candles, the most expensive and desirable type, burn with a clear flame that produces little smoke and a pleasant honey scent. The candlesticks and chandeliers that hold these candles are themselves works of art, their designs reflecting the artistic tastes and technical capabilities of medieval metalworkers. Communication systems that connect the castle to the outside world are essential to the functioning of medieval government. The messenger services that carry letters and documents between castles operate with remarkable efficiency, their riders following established routes that allow for the rapid transmission of information across great distances. The codes and ciphers that are used to protect sensitive communications represent sophisticated understanding of cryptographic principles that will influence the development of secret writing for centuries to come. The record-keeping systems that document the activities of the court are among the most important administrative innovations of the medieval period. The scribes who maintain these records are skilled not only in writing, but also in the complex legal and financial principles that govern medieval society. The documents they create serve not only as records of past events, but also as precedents that will influence future decisions. The preservation of these documents requires careful attention to the materials and techniques that will ensure their survival for future generations. The legal procedures that govern court life represent a sophisticated synthesis of Roman law, Germanic custom, and Christian morality. The judges who preside over court proceedings are scholars who have spent years studying the complex legal traditions that have developed over centuries of practice. The lawyers who argue cases before these judges are skilled in the rhetorical techniques that are necessary to present complex legal arguments in ways that will be persuasive to their audiences. The financial systems that support the elaborate lifestyle of the court involve complex networks of obligation and exchange that extend far beyond the castle walls. The stewards who manage these systems must understand not only the immediate needs of the court, but also the long-term economic trends that will affect the prosperity of the entire region. The accounting methods that they use to track income and expenses are sophisticated tools that allow for the efficient management of resources that are drawn from dozens of different sources. The diplomatic protocols that govern relationships between different courts represent another area of medieval sophistication. The ambassadors who carry out these diplomatic missions are skilled in the complex etiquette that allows representatives of different cultures and political systems to communicate effectively. The treaties and agreements that result from these diplomatic efforts are carefully crafted documents that must balance the competing interests of multiple parties while creating frameworks for future cooperation. The educational systems that prepare young nobles for their future roles in society extend far beyond the formal instruction that they receive in reading, writing, and arithmetic. The apprenticeship programs that connect young people with master craftsmen provide opportunities for the transmission of technical knowledge that cannot be learned from books. The mentorship relationships that develop between experienced courtiers and their younger colleagues create networks of knowledge and influence that will shape the development of medieval society for generations to come. The artistic patronage that characterizes court life represents one of the most important cultural functions of medieval nobility. The poets, musicians, and visual artists who depend on noble support for their livelihood create works that not only entertain their patrons but also preserve and transmit the cultural values that define medieval civilization. The manuscripts that are copied and illuminated in court scriptoriums, the songs that are composed and performed by court musicians, and the tapestries that are woven in court workshops all contribute to the rich cultural heritage that medieval Europe will pass on to future generations. The technological innovations that emerge from the practical needs of court life often have applications that extend far beyond their original purposes. The mechanical clocks that are developed to regulate the daily routines of castle life will eventually revolutionize the organization of work and social life throughout Europe. The optical instruments that are created to assist in astronomical observations will lead to advances in navigation and exploration that will open new worlds to European influence. The chemical processes that are developed for the production of pigments and dyes will contribute to the emergence of experimental science that will transform human understanding of the natural world. The networks of alliance and obligation that connect medieval courts create a system of international relations that spans the entire continent. The marriages that unite noble families from different regions create bonds of kinship that transcend political boundaries. The military alliances that are formed to address common threats create frameworks for cooperation that will influence the development of European diplomacy for centuries to come. The cultural exchanges that result from these connections lead to the transmission of ideas, technologies, and artistic styles that enrich the entire continent. The economic relationships that bind courts to the wider world create systems of trade and exchange that are far more complex and sophisticated than is often realized. The luxury goods that are consumed at court create demand for products that are produced in distant lands, stimulating the development of trade networks that will eventually span the globe. The financial instruments that are developed to facilitate these exchanges represent important innovations in banking and credit that will influence the development of capitalism for centuries to come. Now let us return to the present, but not before we pause to consider what we have learned from this glimpse into the world of the medieval court. Let your mind drift gently back from the candlelit halls and mist-covered battlefields. Let the tension of armor and politics fade. What remains are only footsteps, echoes, and voices carried on the wind. Yet as we prepare to leave this world of tapestries and troubadours, we must remember that the story of medieval France is far from complete. For beyond the castle walls, in the narrow streets of growing cities, another revolution was quietly taking shape. The merchants and craftsmen who supplied the court with its luxuries were beginning to form their own communities, develop their own forms of government, and create new kinds of wealth that would eventually challenge the very foundations of feudal society. It is to these bustling centers of commerce and innovation that we must turn our attention next, with the smell of leather and metal, the sound of hammers and looms, and the voices of a new kind of people all together await our discovery. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From the muddy footpaths of war-torn villages to the flickering candles in royal courts, from the whispered prayers of a teenage saint to the vanished footprints on the fields of Agincourt, we've taken a long, quiet walk through the worn-out corners of medieval France, where survival was a rhythm and silence often said the most. If you're still awake, thanks for staying with me all the way to the end. And if you drifted off somewhere between the tax collectors and the chessboards, that's perfectly fine too. That is, after all, the whole point. If you enjoyed this slower, sleep-friendly dive into history, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. It's always comforting to see where in the world these quiet stories are finding a home. For now, I'll let the sounds of marching boots fade, the fire in the village hearth go still, and the soft voices of the court trail off into the dark. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.